The Arizona night was black as sin, with only scattered stars piercing the darkness. The woman's ragged breathing came in desperate gasps as she ran across the desert floor, her bare feet bleeding from countless cuts. Her copper-red hair streamed behind her like a banner of flame against the darkness. Abigail Rossi hadn't survived 7 years in the wilderness by being easy to catch, but tonight, luck had abandoned her. The distant baying of hounds grew louder, and the thundering hoofbeats behind her closed in with merciless determination. A cold moon emerged from behind scattered clouds, painting the landscape in ghostly silver, exposing her flight. Her foot caught on a hidden rock, and she went down hard. The breath knocked from her lungs. Before she could rise, they were upon her, rough hands dragging her upright, binding her wrists with coarse rope that bit into her skin. "Well, well," said a man's voice thick with satisfaction. "The devil of Red Rock Canyon. Not so fearsome now, are you?" Abby spat at him, tasting blood on her lips. The blow came fast, a backhand that snapped her head to the side and made stars explode across her vision. 7 years, another voice said. 7 years you've stolen from honest folk and terrorized this territory. That ends tonight. As they dragged her toward their horses, Abby's wild green eyes scanned the horizon. For 7 years the wilderness had been her sanctuary, her freedom. Now it stood silent witness to her capture, offering no shelter, no escape. The town of Silver Springs buzzed with excitement on a scorching afternoon in August 1882. Word had spread faster than wildfire. They'd caught her. The red-haired devil. The witch of the canyons. The savage who'd eluded capture for 7 years. The townsfolk gathered in the dusty square, their faces flushed with anticipation and the heat of judgment. Children were hoisted onto shoulders for a better view. Women clutched each other's arms, both fearful and eager to glimpse the infamous creature they'd heard so many tales about. Sheriff Harlow Montgomery stood on the wooden platform erected in the center of the square, his badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. At 55, he carried himself with the weary authority of a man who'd seen too much of human darkness, yet his voice rang out strong and clear. "Citizens of Silver Springs, today marks the end of a reign of terror that has plagued our territory for too long." The crowd roared its approval, a collective thirst for justice, or perhaps vengeance, making them forget the sweltering heat. For 7 years, this woman has lived like an animal, stealing from honest homesteaders, threatening those who crossed her path. And yes, taking the life of a bounty hunter sent to bring her to justice. From the shadows of the jailhouse emerged 2 deputies, dragging between them a figure that barely resembled a woman at all. Her red hair, matted and wild, hung in tangles around a face smudged with dirt and marked by a fresh bruise blooming across one cheekbone. Her hands were bound before her, chains linking to shackles at her ankles. Her green eyes, however, burned with a fierce intelligence that belied her savage appearance. The crowd fell silent for a moment, many having expected some monstrous creature rather than this slip of a woman who couldn't be more than 25. Then the whispers began. "They say she eats human flesh. I heard she bewitched a man's cattle to walk off a cliff. My cousin's friend saw her dancing with demons under the full moon." Sheriff Montgomery raised his hand for silence. "By the power vested in me, I declare this woman, known to us only as the red-haired devil, to be auctioned to the highest bidder. The proceeds will compensate those she has wronged and pay for the burial of Travis Hodge, the bounty hunter whose life she took." A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. "An auction rather than a hanging, sheriff," called a voice from the crowd. "Why not just hang her and be done with it?" Montgomery's face tightened. Justice takes many forms, Mr. Peterson. The territorial governor believes this creature can be rehabilitated through honest labor. Who am I to question his wisdom? The explanation satisfied few, but the promise of spectacle quelled further objections. The bidding starts at $20. The crowd pressed closer as voices called out bids, each accompanied by commentary on what the bidder planned to do with such a notorious purchase. 25. I'll have her breaking rocks at my quarry until she's too worn to cause trouble. 30. My boys will keep her in line. She'll learn civilization or feel the whip. 40. I'll put her in a cage where folks can pay to see the savage woman of the West. Throughout it all, the woman stood unmoving, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as though she were not present at all. A survival skill learned through years of suffering. From the back of the gathering, a tall figure observed the proceedings with increasing disgust. Mason Blackwood's steel-blue eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his black hat. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built his own legacy from nothing. A long scar ran down his right cheek, a permanent reminder of the price he'd paid for that legacy. As owner of the Whispering Pines Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory, Mason was respected, even feared by some, but rarely understood. He'd come to town for supplies, not to witness human degradation, disguised as justice. The bidding continued, growing more heated, as two men became particularly invested in the outcome. $60, shouted Wallace Thornton, a wealthy landowner whose cattle empire had been built through means few dared question. His fleshy face flushed with excitement as he eyed the woman like a prized mare. I'll make her the main attraction at my traveling show, the tamed devil woman of Arizona. 70, countered another voice belonging to a ranch hand known for his cruelty to both animals and women. 80. Thornton raised his voice, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. And worth every penny to show what happens to women who forget their place. The woman's eyes finally snapped to Thornton's face, a flash of recognition and hatred darkening her features before she composed herself once more. 90, cried the opposing bidder, but his voice lacked conviction. $100. Thornton's triumphant shout silenced the crowd. He stepped forward, already reaching for his wallet. She's mine. $300. The quiet, firm voice cut through the square like a knife. The crowd parted, turning to stare at Mason Blackwood as he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. 300? He repeated, meeting Sheriff Montgomery's startled gaze. Cash. Thornton's face contorted with rage. Now, see here, Blackwood. Do I hear $350? Montgomery interrupted suddenly, eager to conclude the proceedings. Thornton glared at Mason, then at the sheriff. This is irregular. I had the winning bid. The bidding continues until I say it's done, Montgomery replied, avoiding Thornton's eyes. 300 going once. You have no use for such a creature, Blackwood, Thornton hissed, unless you've developed unusual tastes in your solitude. Mason didn't deign to respond, his gaze steady on Montgomery. Going twice. 350. Thornton spat, his face purple with anger. 400, Mason countered immediately. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the price climbed far beyond what anyone had anticipated for a half-wild criminal. At $500, Thornton finally backed down his eyes, promising retribution. Take the devil, bitch, he snarled. You'll regret it soon enough. Mason approached the platform, counting out bills from a leather wallet. As he handed them to Montgomery, he spoke in a low voice that only the sheriff could hear. She didn't kill that bounty hunter, did she, Harlow? Montgomery's eyes widened fractionally before he controlled his expression. What are you talking about? There were witnesses. I'm sure there were, Mason replied evenly. just as I'm sure those witnesses saw exactly what they were told to see." The sheriff's face paled slightly. "You're buying trouble, Mason. More than you know. Wouldn't be the first time." Mason turned to the woman who was studying him with wary intensity. "Remove those chains." One of the deputies hesitated, looking to Montgomery for confirmation. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. As the shackles fell away, the woman rubbed her raw wrists, her gaze never leaving Mason's face. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "She's not an animal," Mason said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's a human being." He extended his hand toward her, not touching, merely offering. "Come. My wagon's this way." Everyone's surprise, including perhaps her own, the woman followed him, without resistance, walking with her head high despite her ragged appearance and the hostile stares of the townspeople. As they reached his wagon loaded with supplies, Mason helped her onto the seat, ignoring the whispers and stares of the crowd. He untied his horse from the back of the wagon and mounted. "Can you drive?" he asked her. She nodded once, a short, sharp movement. "Then follow me. It's a long ride to Whispering Pines." As they left Silver Springs behind, the woman held the reins with surprising skill, her back straight, her eyes forward. Only when the town had disappeared from view did she speak, her voice rough from disuse. "What?" Mason didn't pretend to misunderstand the question. "Because what they were doing back there was wrong." "Not your problem," she countered, her words clipped and wary. "I made it my problem." He studied her profile for a moment. "I know you're innocent, Abigail Rossi." Her head whipped around, shock replacing the careful neutrality of her expression. The wagon swerved slightly before she corrected its course. "How do you know that name?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "No one has called me that in 7 years. Because I knew your father, Lorenzo Rossi." Mason's voice softened slightly. "He was a friend." The woman, Abigail, stared at him as though he'd grown a second head. Then her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "My father had no friends in this territory, only enemies who wanted what he found. I wasn't from this territory when I knew him. We met in Colorado, 1872. He was surveying for the railroad company I worked for. Brilliant man. Spoke about his daughters often. Isabella and little Abigail." She flinched at the mention of her sister's name, her knuckles whitening on the reins. "If you're trying to trick me—" "I have no reason to trick you," Mason interrupted. "Your father saved my life during a rock slide. I owed him a debt I could never repay. When I heard rumors of a red-haired devil woman living in the canyons, I wondered if it might be one of Lorenzo's daughters. Took me years to confirm it." Abigail fell silent, processing this information's suspicion, warring with a desperate desire to believe him. "What happened to your family wasn't an accident, Abigail. And you didn't kill that bounty hunter." Her green eyes, so fiercely guarded, suddenly shimmered with unshed tears. She blinked them back quickly, her jaw tightening. "Who are you?" she asked finally. "Mason Blackwood. I own Whispering Pines Ranch, about 5 hours' ride from here." "And what do you want from me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication and the weight of her 7 years of survival, of learning that nothing came without a price. "Nothing," Mason answered simply. "I want to give you a safe place to stay while we figure out how to clear your name. After that, what you do is your choice." Abigail studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her attention back to the road, her posture still rigid with distrust. "I've heard that before," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Mason didn't press further. They rode in silence as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Two strangers bound by the ghost of a man long dead, heading toward an uncertain future. Whispering Pines Ranch emerged from the gathering dusk like a mirage, a sprawling collection of sturdy buildings nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills that gave the place its name. A large two-story main house stood at its center, built from locally quarried stone and timber that had weathered to a silvery gray. Nearby stood a substantial barn bunkhouse and various outbuildings, all speaking of prosperity earned through hard work. As they approached, Abigail tensed visibly, her eyes darting to calculate escape routes, assessing threats with the instincts of a cornered animal. "No one will harm you here," Mason said quietly, noticing her reaction. She didn't acknowledge his words, keeping her focus on their surroundings. A tall black man emerged from the barn, followed by a lanky teenage boy who hung back watching with wary curiosity. The man approached with measured steps, his weathered face breaking into a smile of welcome for Mason that turned to surprise when he spotted Abigail. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his deep voice tinged with a southern accent. "Wasn't expecting you back with company." "Ezra," Mason nodded in greeting. "This is Abigail Rossi. She'll be staying with us for a while." If Ezra recognized the name or found anything unusual about the situation, he gave no indication. He simply touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Miss Rossi, welcome to Whispering Pines." Abigail stared at him, clearly startled by the courteous greeting. "Ezra Collins is my foreman," Mason explained. "He runs this place better than I do, truth be told." "Mr. Blackwood exaggerates," Ezra replied with a small smile. "But I do keep things in order when he's away." He gestured to the boy hovering nearby. "That's Noah, Mr. Blackwood's son." The boy, no more than 16, ducked his head when Abigail's gaze landed on him. He had his father's blue eyes, but none of his confidence. His thin frame almost hunched as though trying to make himself smaller invisible. "Noah," Mason called gently, "come say hello to our guest." The boy approached reluctantly, keeping his eyes downcast. He stopped a few paces away, giving a quick nod that might have been a greeting before retreating back toward the barn without a word. "My son doesn't speak much," Mason said, a shadow crossing his face. "Not anymore." Before Abigail could respond, if she had planned to, the door of the main house opened and a stout Mexican woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Por fin, I thought you'd been swallowed by that town," she called to Mason, her accent thick but her English clear. Her dark eyes widened when she spotted Abigail. "Y quién es esta?" "Sophia, this is Abigail Rossi. She'll be staying with us for a while." "Abigail, this is Sophia Martinez, the best cook in the territory, and the reason we're all still alive." Sophia studied Abigail with undisguised curiosity, taking in her ragged appearance and guarded posture. Then, to Abigail's evident surprise, she simply nodded. "You look half-starved, Nina. Come inside. Dinner is almost ready." Abigail remained frozen beside the wagon, overwhelmed by the casual acceptance of these strangers. "You must be tired," Mason said, his voice gentle but not pitying. "Sophia will show you where you can clean up before dinner." Still, Abigail hesitated, her instinct for self-preservation warring with exhaustion and the promise of safety. "The room has a lock," Mason added quietly, "and a separate door to the outside. You're not a prisoner here, Abigail." Something in his tone, not condescension but understanding, seemed to reach her. She gave a short, abrupt nod and followed Sophia toward the house, maintaining a careful distance between herself and the older woman. As they disappeared inside, Ezra turned to Mason with a raised eyebrow. "The red-haired devil?" he asked. his voice pitched low. Mason nodded, unsurprised by Ezra's recognition. Little happened in the territory that the foreman didn't know about. She's Lorenzo Rossi's daughter. Understanding dawned in Ezra's eyes. The Italian surveyor who found that gold deposit up in Red Rock Canyon. The same. Folks said his whole family was killed by Apaches. That's what folks were meant to believe. Mason's jaw tightened. She's been surviving on her own for 7 years, Ezra. Hunted like an animal for a crime she didn't commit. Ezra absorbed this information with the thoughtful silence of a man who'd seen too much injustice to be shocked by one more example. Thornton's involved, I take it. Up to his neck, if I had to guess. The foreman nodded slowly. We'll need to keep sharp eyes out. That man doesn't let go of grudges easily. No, he doesn't. Mason's hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his cheek. Have someone watch the North Ridge at night. That's the most likely approach if they come. Already planning on it. Ezra glanced toward the house. Does she know why you've brought her here? Not all of it. She's not ready to trust anyone yet. Mason ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking every one of his 38 years. Hell, I'm not sure she'll ever trust anyone again after what she's been through. Time will tell, Ezra said philosophically. Meanwhile, you should go check on Noah. He was upset when you didn't return yesterday. Mason nodded, his expression softening at the mention of his son. How has he been? Same as always. Spends most of his time with the horses. That new Mustang you brought in last month has taken a shine to him. And at least the horses talk back to him in their way, Mason said with a sad smile. I'll go find him now. As Mason headed toward the barn, Ezra called after him. Boss, this is going to stir up trouble. You sure it's worth it? Mason paused, looking back at his foreman. Her father once told me, a debt unpaid is a chain around your soul. I've been carrying those chains for 10 years, Ezra. It's time to break them, one way or another. Sophia led Abigail to a small but clean room off the kitchen. It contained a narrow bed with fresh linens, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a simple chest of drawers, and a rocking chair by the window. As promised, there was a lock on the inside of the door and another door that led directly outside. Bathroom is down the hall, Sophia said, her tone matter-of-fact. I'll bring hot water for washing. There's a dress in the chest that might fit you. Belonged to Dr. Reed when she stays over sometimes. Abigail stood in the center of the room, unwilling to touch anything with her filthy hands, unable to process the simple kindness of these arrangements. Why? She asked finally the same question she'd posed to Mason. Sophia turned, studying her with shrewd eyes that had seen much of life's cruelty and joy. Why, what, Nina? Why are you helping me? You know who they say I am. They say many things in this territory. Most of it is basura, garbage. Sophia shrugged. Mr. Blackwood is a good judge of character. If he brought you here, he has his reasons. You trust him that much? With my life, Sophia replied without hesitation. 5 years ago, my sons were killed by border raiders. My village blamed me for bringing bad luck. Mr. Blackwood found me half dead on the trail and brought me here. Never asked for anything in return, except honest work. She stepped closer, her gaze direct but not unkind. Whatever you've done to survive, Nina, it does not matter here. At Whispering Pines, we all have our ghosts. We just learn to live with them. With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Alone for the first time since her capture, Abigail's careful composure cracked. Her legs gave way and she sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear, exhaustion, and confusion. 7 years of constant vigilance had left her unprepared for kindness. When Sophia returned with the promised hot water, she found Abigail still sitting rigid on the bed, her eyes fixed on the window and the darkening sky beyond. "Dinner in 30 minutes, Sophia said, setting down the steaming pitcher. "You come or not, your choice, but my stew is worth eating, even for wild things like you." After the older woman left, Abigail approached the washstand cautiously, as though it might be a trap. She poured water into the bowl, the steam rising with a scent of something floral. Soap, she realized, a luxury she'd almost forgotten. Slowly, methodically, she began to wash away 7 years of wilderness living, watching the water turn gray and then black. She scrubbed until her skin was pink and raw, as though she could erase not just the dirt, but the memories, the fear, the constant fight for survival. In the small mirror above the washstand, a stranger stared back at her. A gaunt woman with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes, her red hair a tangled mess despite her attempts to comb it with her fingers. 7 years ago, she had been a girl of 16, soft with youth and innocence. That girl was gone forever, replaced by this hard-eyed survivor who trusted nothing and no one. The dress Sophia had mentioned lay folded in the chest, a simple blue cotton garment that hung loose on Abigail's thin frame, but was cleaner than anything she'd worn in years. She fingered the fabric with wonder, the simple pleasure of clean clothes almost overwhelming. A soft knock at the door made her flinch, her hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Dinner's ready," came Sophia's voice. "Come eat." Abigail hesitated, torn between hunger and caution. Finally, hunger won out. She hadn't eaten since before her capture, and her body's demands could no longer be ignored. She unlocked the door cautiously, half expecting to find armed men waiting to seize her. Instead, there was only the smell of hearty stew and fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. The large farm table was set for 5, with Mason already seated at its head. Ezra sat to his right, while Sophia bustled about, placing a large pot in the center of the table. Noah slipped in quietly, taking a seat as far from his father as possible, his eyes darting nervously around the room. All activity ceased when Abigail appeared in the doorway. She stood frozen, ready to flee at the first sign of threat. "Join us," Mason said simply, gesturing to an empty chair. Abigail remained where she was, her gaze flicking from face to face, assessing, calculating. "Food's getting cold," Sophia announced, breaking the tension. "Sit or don't sit, but decide quickly." Something about the woman's no-nonsense attitude eased Abigail's paralysis. She moved to the table, choosing the seat closest to the door, her back to the wall. A position that allowed her to watch everyone and keep her escape route clear. Sophia ladled stew into bowls, the rich aroma making Abigail's stomach clench with hunger. Still, she didn't touch her food, watching as the others began to eat. Mason noticed her hesitation and understood its cause. He reached over, took a spoonful from her bowl, and ate it without comment. The gesture acknowledged her fear of poison without drawing attention to it, a simple reassurance that the food was safe. Abigail waited a moment longer, then picked up her spoon. The first taste of the hearty stew, rich with meat, vegetables, and spices, nearly undid her. She hadn't realized how accustomed she'd become to raw or barely cooked food, to the constant edge of hunger that had been her companion for 7 years. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to bolt the food like a starving animal, though that's exactly what she was. As she ate, she listened to the quiet conversation around the table. Ezra reporting on the day's work, Mason asking about specific cattle, Sophia complaining about a shortage of flour. Normal talk, safe talk. Nothing about the wild woman they'd welcomed to their table. "The Mustang's coming along," Ezra said, glancing at Noah. "Your boy's got away with her. Gentlest hand I've seen with a horse that's spirited." Noah ducked his head at the praise, a flush creeping up his neck, but he didn't speak. "That doesn't surprise me," Mason replied with a fond look at his son. "Noah's always had a gift for understanding creatures that can't use words." Abigail watched the interaction with guarded curiosity. The boy's silence seemed to be accepted as normal, but there was an undercurrent of sadness in the way Mason looked at him, as though remembering a different child from an earlier time. "Miss Rossi," Ezra said suddenly, turning his attention to her, "you've lived in the wilderness for some time. Ever encounter that pack of wolves that's been troubling our south pasture?" Abigail tensed at being directly addressed, her hand tightening on her spoon. But the question wasn't threatening, just conversational, treating her unusual background as a potential source of useful information rather than a mark of savagery. "Gray wolves," she said, her voice still rough from disuse. 5 adults, 3 cubs born this spring. They hunt mainly deer and rabbits. Stay away from humans unless threatened." Ezra nodded thoughtfully. "That matches what I've observed. They took a calf last month, though. Probably because their usual hunting grounds were disrupted by the logging operation in Weber's Canyon." Abigail replied, then fell silent, surprised by her own willingness to engage. "Makes sense," Ezra agreed. "Wolves don't change their habits without reason." The conversation flowed around her again, neither demanding her participation nor excluding her. It was peaceful, a word she'd almost forgotten the meaning of. As the meal concluded, Mason finally addressed her directly. "Abigail, tomorrow we can talk more about why I brought you here. For tonight, rest. You're safe." She met his gaze, measuring the truth in his words. "No one's safe," she replied softly. "Not really." A shadow crossed Mason's face, recognition of a truth he couldn't deny. "Perhaps not. But tonight, you have walls around you, a lock on your door, and people who will stand between you and harm. It's more than you had yesterday." Abigail couldn't argue with that. She nodded once, then rose from the table. "Thank you for the meal," she said to Sophia, the words rusty with disuse, but sincere. "De nada, niña. Sleep well." As Abigail retreated to her room, Mason watched her go, his expression troubled. "She reminds me of that Mustang when we first brought her in," Ezra observed quietly. "Wild, yes, but more than that, wounded in ways you can't see." "Some wounds never fully heal," Mason replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the scar on his cheek. "But they can become bearable with time." In her room, Abigail stood by the window looking out at the starlit landscape. For 7 years, she'd slept under these same stars, but always with one eye open, always alert for danger. The softness of the bed behind her was an almost forgotten luxury, yet she hesitated to surrender to its comfort. Finally, she dragged the blanket and pillow to the floor in the corner of the room, positioning herself where she could see both doors and the window. She laid her head down, one hand clutching a butter knife she'd quietly taken from the table. A poor weapon, but better than nothing. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Abigail's last coherent thought was that she didn't understand these people or their kindness, but for the first time in 7 years, she might allow herself a few hours of true sleep. Mason sat at his desk long after the rest of the household had retired, a lamp burning low beside him. Before him lay an old journal, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He turned the pages slowly, his fingers tracing the neat handwriting of a man 10 years dead. April 12, 1872. Found promising geological formations in the North Canyon. If my suspicions are correct, this could be the richest gold deposit discovered in this territory. Must proceed with caution. too many hungry eyes, watching. Mason sipped from a glass of whiskey, his eyes distant with memory. Lorenzo Rossi had been brilliant, methodical, and tragically naive about the depths of human greed. He'd believed in science, in progress, in the fundamental decency of his fellow man. That belief had cost him everything. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He closed the journal quickly, sliding it into a drawer before calling, "Come in." Audra entered, his expression grave. "Rider coming in from town. It's Dr. Reed." Mason frowned. At this hour, something must be wrong. He rose and followed Ezra to the porch, where they watched a horse and rider approaching at a steady pace. As they drew closer, the figure resolved into a woman in a dark riding habit, her posture straight, despite what must have been a long journey. "Eleanor," Mason called as she reined in her horse. "What brings you out here so late?" Dr. Eleanor Reed dismounted with the ease of a woman who'd spent more time in a saddle than was considered proper for a lady of her standing. At 40, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down prejudice and emerged stronger for it. Her brown hair was streaked with gray and pulled back in a practical bun, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene before her. "I came as soon as I heard Mason," she said, her voice pitched low. "Is it true you bought the red-haired devil at auction?" Mason's expression tightened. "Her name is Abigail Rossi, and yes, I did." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded as though confirming something to herself. "Lorenzo Rossi's daughter. I thought as much when I heard the descriptions, but I couldn't be certain." "You knew Lorenzo?" Mason asked, surprised. "I treated his wife for consumption shortly before the tragedy." Eleanor's gaze was direct. "Those girls didn't die in an Apache raid, did they?" "No," Mason replied grimly. "They didn't." Eleanor sighed, removing her gloves. "I need to examine her, Mason. From what I heard, she's been living wild for years. There could be any number of health concerns." "She's only just started to trust us, Eleanor. A medical examination might undo that progress." "Better to undo progress than to miss an infection or illness that could kill her." Eleanor's tone was firm but compassionate. "I'll be gentle, I promise. And it might help that I'm a woman." Mason considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "She's in the guest room off the kitchen, but let me speak to her first." They entered the house quietly, mindful of the late hour. Mason knocked softly on Abigail's door, not surprised when there was no immediate answer. "Abigail," he called softly. "It's Mason. Dr. Reed is here. She'd like to check you for injuries or illness. May we come in?" Silence stretched for a long moment before the lock clicked and the door opened a crack. Abigail's green eyes, alert, despite the late hour, assessed them warily. "I'm not sick," she said flatly. "Perhaps not," Eleanor replied, her professional demeanor tempered with genuine concern. "But you've been through an ordeal, and I'd like to make sure you're physically well. I won't do anything without your permission." Abigail hesitated, then opened the door wider, allowing them to enter. Mason noticed that she'd made a nest of blankets in the corner rather than using the bed, and that she kept a firm grip on what appeared to be a butter knife. He chose not to comment on either observation. "I'll leave you with Dr. Reed," he said, backing toward the door. "She's a friend. You can trust her." Abigail's expression suggested that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but she nodded curtly. Once Mason had left, Eleanor set her medical bag on the table and turned to Abigail with a kind but professional smile. "I knew your father briefly," she said as she began unpacking her instruments. "He was a good man, very proud of his daughters." Abigail's expression flickered with surprise before settling back into guarded neutrality. "I'd like to check your lungs' heart and look for any injuries that might need treatment. Eleanor continued. Is that acceptable? After a moment's consideration, Abigail gave a short nod. Eleanor's examination was thorough but gentle. She listened to Abigail's breathing, checked her reflexes, examined the bruises from her capture, and disinfected several small cuts. Throughout, she maintained a soothing monologue, explaining what she was doing and why treating Abigail with the same respect she'd show any patient. You're malnourished, she concluded finally, but that's to be expected given your circumstances. A few weeks of regular meals should help. The bruises will heal on their own. Otherwise, you're remarkably healthy for someone who's been living rough for so long. Abigail accepted this assessment without comment, but some of the tension had left her shoulders during the examination. Eleanor's matter-of-fact approach and lack of judgment had eased her initial wariness. May I ask how you survived out there for 7 years? Eleanor asked as she packed up her instruments. From a medical perspective, it's quite extraordinary. Abigail seemed to weigh the question, perhaps searching for hidden motives. Finding none, she replied simply, I watched, learned, adapted. Remarkable, Eleanor murmured. Most people wouldn't have lasted a month. Most people give up too easily. Eleanor smiled at that. I suspect you're right. She closed her bag with a decisive click. Well, Miss Rosie, physically you're on the mend. As for the rest, time is often the best medicine. As she turned to leave, Abigail spoke again, her voice barely audible. They said I killed a man, a bounty hunter. Eleanor paused, looking back. And did you? No. Abigail's green eyes burned with sudden intensity. I've stolen to survive. I've threatened when cornered, but I've never taken a human life. The doctor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you, she said simply. And for what it's worth, I suspect Mason does too. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. After Eleanor left, Abigail returned to her nest of blankets in the corner, her mind whirling with the day's events. From captured fugitive to what guessed charity case, she didn't understand Mason Blackwood's motivations, but for tonight, at least she was safe and fed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She dozed fitfully, decades of survival instinct preventing deep sleep in this unfamiliar place. Sometime in the early hours before dawn, she was jolted awake by a sound, a cry quickly muffled. Abigail rose silently, the butter knife clutched in her hand. She listened intently, identifying the source as somewhere upstairs. After a moment's hesitation, she crept from her room and down the hallway, following the sound. The main staircase creaked slightly under her weight, but she moved with the stealth of a predator, placing each foot carefully. At the top of the stairs, she paused, orienting herself toward the noise, a whimpering sound punctuated by words she couldn't quite make out. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Abigail approached cautiously, peering through the crack. Inside, illuminated by moonlight streaming through an open window, she saw Mason seated on the edge of a bed. He was bent over the form of his son Noah, who thrashed in the grip of what appeared to be a nightmare. Shh, it's all right. Mason was murmuring, his voice gentle, as he stroked the boy's hair. You're safe, Noah. It's just a dream. The boy's eyes flew open, wild with terror. He scrambled back against the headboard, his mouth opening in a silent scream. It's me, son, Mason said, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. It's just your father, you're home, you're safe. Recognition slowly dawned in Noah's eyes. He relaxed marginally, though his breath still came in ragged gasps. The same dream, Mason asked softly. Noah nodded, pulling his knees to his chest. She wasn't your fault, Noah. You have to believe that." The pain in Mason's voice was raw, unguarded. "Your mother's death wasn't your fault." Noah turned his face away, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mason reached out hesitantly, then withdrew his hand when Noah flinched. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I wish I knew how to help you." The scene was so intensely private that Abigail felt like an intruder. She backed away, silently retreating downstairs to her room. As she curled back into her blankets, Abigail found herself troubled by what she'd witnessed. Mason Blackwood, the confident rancher who'd stood up to an entire town, looked broken in that upstairs room. And his son, trapped in a silence that seemed both choice and prison, haunted by a mother's death. "Everyone has their ghosts," Sophia had said. At Whispering Pines, it seemed those ghosts were as real as the living. Dawn broke over Whispering Pines in a spectacular array of pinks and golds, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the pines that gave the ranch its name. Abigail woke instantly alert, as always momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before memory rushed back. She rose and dressed quickly in the blue dress, though she found herself longing for the practical if ragged trousers she'd worn for years. A dress was confining, impractical for quick movement or self-defense. But it was clean, and for now, that was enough. The kitchen was already busy when she emerged. Sophia worked at the large cast-iron stove, the smell of coffee bacon and fresh bread filling the air. Ezra sat at the table discussing the day's work with two ranch hands Abigail hadn't met the night before. They fell silent when she appeared, their eyes widening with recognition and curiosity. "Ah, you're up," Sophia said, glancing over her shoulder. "Sit, eat, coffee's hot." Abigail hesitated, uncomfortable under the stares of the ranch hands. "Jim Pete, this is Miss Rosie," Ezra said firmly. "She's Mr. Blackwood's guest. Make her welcome." The older of the two men, weathered by years of outdoor work, touched his hat respectfully. "Ma'am?" The younger one continued to stare until Ezra cleared his throat pointedly. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Welcome to Whispering Pines." Abigail nodded awkwardly, unused to such courteous treatment after years of being viewed as little more than an animal. She took the same seat she'd occupied at dinner, back to the wall eyes on the room. Sophia placed a plate before her, eggs, bacon, and fresh bread with honey. Abigail's mouth watered at the sight, but she waited until others had begun eating before touching her food, still wary of poison despite the previous night's meal passing without incident. Mason entered a few minutes later, looking tired but composed. If he'd spent much of the night comforting his son, it showed only in the slight shadows beneath his eyes. "Good morning," he said, his gaze touching briefly on Abigail before moving to the others. "Jim Pete, I want you both riding the north boundary today. Keep an eye out for strangers." The men nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "Where's Noah?" Mason asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Sophia. "Already in the barn," Ezra replied. "That boy rises with the birds." Mason's expression softened with a mixture of pride and sadness. "He always has." As the men finished their breakfast and departed for their day's work, Mason turned his attention to Abigail. "If you're feeling up to it, I'd like to show you the ranch today. Help you get your bearings." Abigail regarded him cautiously. "Why am I here, Mr. Blackwood? Really?" Mason considered her for a moment, then nodded as though he'd come to a decision. "Let's talk in my study. It's more private." He led her to a room off the main hallway, a comfortable space lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. Maps of the territory covered one wall marked with notations Abigail couldn't decipher from a distance. Mason closed the door behind them, then moved to a cabinet from which he withdrew the journal Abigail had glimpsed the night before. "This belonged to your father," he said, placing it on the desk between them. "His survey journal from 1872–1873. Abigail stared at the book, her hand reaching out involuntarily before she pulled it back. "How did you get this?" "Lorenzo gave it to me for safekeeping shortly before he was killed. He suspected he was being watched, that his discovery was too valuable to remain secret for long." "The gold," Abigail said softly. "In Red Rock Canyon." Mason looked up sharply. "You know about that?" "I overheard my father and Isabella talking the night before." She swallowed hard. "Before they came. Men with torches. They killed my parents, burned our home. Isabella and I were hidden in the root cellar. We heard everything." Mason's expression darkened with anger and grief. "I'm sorry, Abigail. Lorenzo was a good man. He didn't deserve such an end." After, Abigail continued, her voice distant, as she revisited memories long suppressed. "A man found us hiding, said he'd take us somewhere safe, but he sold us instead, to different men." Her green eyes hardened. "I was 13. Isabella was 17. Mason's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "And you escaped." 3 years later, the man who bought me—" She stopped, unwilling or unable to elaborate. "I took his horse and rode until it died beneath me. Then I walked, kept walking until I found the canyons, learned to survive, to disappear. And all this time, you've been blamed for crimes you didn't commit, hunted like an animal." Mason's voice was tight with controlled rage. "While Wallace Thornton grew rich from your father's discovery, built an empire on stolen gold and murdered innocents." Abigail's head snapped up at the name. "Thornton, the man from the auction. The same. He's controlled this territory for years through violence and intimidation. Few dare to stand against him." "But you do," Abigail observed, studying him with new interest. "Why—" Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his cheek. "Let's just say Thornton and I have history. Bad blood." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "Abigail, I brought you here because I believe together we can bring Thornton to justice. For your family, for others he's harmed, for the bounty hunter whose death you're blamed for." "Why would anyone believe me? I'm the red-haired devil, remember, a savage. A murderer." "Because we'll find proof," Mason replied firmly. "Your father's journal contains coordinates, geological surveys, evidence that Thornton's gold mine rightfully belongs to you and your sister, and I have connections with the territorial governor. If we can build a strong enough case—" "My sister is dead," Abigail interrupted flatly. "She didn't escape like I did." Mason frowned. "Are you certain there was no body found? She would have found me if she were alive. Isabella wouldn't have abandoned me." The certainty in Abigail's voice brooked no argument, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face momentarily. "Perhaps," Mason conceded. "But Abigail, this is your chance for justice, for reclaiming your name and your birthright. Will you help me?" Abigail stared at him, weighing his words, searching for deception, and finding none. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since her arrival. "What do you get out of this, Mr. Blackwood? Why risk everything for a stranger?" Mason was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window and the pine-covered hills beyond. When he spoke, his voice was soft with memory. 10 years ago, your father saved my life during a rock slide in Colorado. When I asked how I could repay him, he said, 'If ever my family needs help, you'll know your debt.' Later, after I moved to Arizona, I heard rumors about the Rossi massacre, By then, it was too late to save your parents, but I never stopped looking for their daughters." He turned back to her, his expression solemn. "I don't expect you to trust me, Abigail. You've survived this long by trusting no one. But I'm asking you to work with me to use your knowledge of the canyons and your father's journal to build a case against Thornton. After that, whether you stay or go is entirely your choice." Abigail sat in silence, absorbing his words. For 7 years, she'd lived by her wits and instincts, seeing humans only as threats to be avoided. The idea of alliance of shared purpose was as foreign to her now as the soft bed and clean clothes. "I need time," she said finally, "to think." Mason nodded, accepting her caution as reasonable. "Of course. In the meantime, the offer to show you the ranch still stands. It might help to know your surroundings." After a moment's consideration, Abigail agreed with a short nod. She needed to map escape routes to understand the terrain around her, survival habits too deeply ingrained to abandon regardless of Mason's apparent sincerity. They left the study together, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. As they crossed the yard toward the barn, Abigail became aware of someone watching them. She turned her head sharply, spotting Noah, half hidden in the barn doorway, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that belied his youth. When he realized she had noticed him, he ducked back into the shadows of the barn, disappearing like a startled deer. "Noah's curious about you," Mason observed, having noticed the exchange. "That's more interest than he's shown in anything except horses for a long time." "What happened to him?" Abigail asked before she could stop herself. "Why doesn't he speak?" Mason's steps faltered slightly, pain flashing across his features. 3 years ago, my wife Catherine took her own life. Noah found her. He hasn't spoken a word since that day." The stark admission hung in the air between them, a glimpse of the ghost that haunted Whispering Pines. "I'm sorry," Abigail said awkwardly, unused to offering comfort. Mason acknowledged her words with a slight nod. "The mind protects itself as it can. Some wounds leave no visible scars." He glanced at her, understanding in his gaze. "I suspect you know something about that." Before Abigail could respond, the peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming fast. Mason's expression hardened as he moved instinctively in front of Abigail. "Get to the house," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Find Ezra." But it was too late for retreat. 5 riders thundered into the yard, dust billowing around them as they reined in their mounts. At their head rode Sheriff Harlow Montgomery, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Beside him sat Wallace Thornton, his fleshy face twisted in a triumphant smirk. "Mason Blackwood," Montgomery called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I have a warrant for the arrest of the fugitive, known as the Red-Haired Devil, charged with escape from lawful custody and the murder of Travis Hodge." Mason stepped forward, his stance casual but his eyes alert. "There's no fugitive here, Harlow. Just my guest, Miss Abigail Rossi, whose freedom I purchased legally yesterday. Or have you forgotten the auction you yourself conducted?" Montgomery flushed slightly. "New evidence has come to light." "Oh, and what evidence might that be?" Mason's tone was dangerously pleasant. "Let me guess. Mr. Thornton suddenly remembered some crucial detail." Thornton urged his horse forward. "Watch your tone, Blackwood. The sheriff's just doing his duty." "His duty?" Mason laughed without humor. "Is that what you call it?" By now Ezra had emerged from the bunkhouse, rifle in hand, but held casually at his side. 2 ranch hands appeared from the barn, positioned to flank the visitors. The atmosphere crackled with tension. "I have the bill of sale," Mason continued evenly. "Signed by you, Sheriff, transferring all claim on Miss Rossi to me in exchange for $500. Unless you're planning to refund that money, I suggest you take your warrant and leave my property." Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "The law's the law, Mason. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "The law?" Mason's voice hardened. Was it the law that condemned an innocent woman without trial? Was it the law that looked the other way when Lorenzo Rossi and his wife were murdered for discovering gold on their property? A ripple of unease passed through the sheriff's men. Thornton's face darkened with anger. "You're treading dangerous ground, Blackwood," he snarled. "Very dangerous ground." "I've been on dangerous ground since the day I moved to this territory," Mason replied coldly. "Nothing new there." Throughout this exchange, Abigail had stood slightly behind Mason, taking in every detail, calculating odds, planning escape routes. Now she stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with a fury long suppressed. "I remember you," she said, her gaze fixed on Thornton. "You were there the night my parents died. You gave the order." Thornton's expression flickered momentarily before settling into a sneer. "The devil woman's delusional sheriff. Further proof she's dangerous and belongs behind bars, or, better yet, at the end of a rope." "You know I'm right," Abigail continued, her voice steady, despite the rage coursing through her. "You recognized me at the auction. That's why you were so determined to buy me, to silence me permanently." "This is absurd," Thornton blustered, but his eyes darted nervously to the men around him. "Sheriff, do your duty." Montgomery hesitated, caught between Thornton's demands and the growing unease of his deputies. Mason's stance made it clear that any attempt to take Abigail would meet with armed resistance. "The territorial governor might be interested to hear about today's events," Mason said conversationally, "especially since I sent him a telegram yesterday detailing Miss Rossie's situation and my concerns about corruption in Silver Springs." This was a bluff. Mason had sent no such telegram. But Montgomery paled visibly. The sheriff was a weak man, not an evil one, and the prospect of official scrutiny clearly unnerved him. "This isn't over," Thornton snapped, jerking his horse's head around. "Not by a long shot. The woman's dangerous, Blackwood. She'll bring you nothing but trouble." "Trouble seems to find me regardless," Mason replied with dangerous calm. "Good day, gentlemen." The riders departed as they had arrived in a cloud of dust and resentment. Only when they were well down the road did Mason turn to Abigail concern, replacing the cold anger in his eyes. "Are you all right?" She nodded curtly, though her hands trembled slightly from the rush of confronting her family's murderer face to face. "You just made a powerful enemy," she said quietly. "Thornton was already my enemy," Mason replied, his hand moving unconsciously to his scar. "This just raises the stakes." Ezra approached rifle now held more openly. "I'll double the watch tonight, boss, and send Jim to alert the hands at the north pasture." Mason nodded his agreement. "Thornton won't try anything in broad daylight, but after dark." "We'll be ready," Ezra assured him, then nodded respectfully to Abigail before heading toward the bunkhouse. Left alone with Mason, Abigail studied him with new eyes. He'd stood between her and danger without hesitation, risked his ranch and possibly his life to protect someone he barely knew. It didn't make sense. Not in the harsh world she'd inhabited for 7 years, where survival meant trusting no one. "Why did you do that?" she asked finally. "You could have given me to them, avoided all this trouble." Mason's blue eyes met hers directly. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I'm tired of men like Thornton thinking they can take whatever they want without consequences." "There will be consequences," Abigail warned. "For you, for everyone here." "I know." Mason's expression was grim but determined. "But some fights are worth the cost." As they stood in the sunlit yard, the pine-scented breeze carrying the promise of approaching summer, Abigail felt something shift within her, a crack in the hard shell of survival that had encased her for 7 years. This man, this place, they represented something she'd thought lost forever. Hope. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. More dangerous than anger or fear or hate. Those emotions had kept her alive in the wilderness. Hope could destroy her if misplaced. And yet, looking at Mason Blackwood's scarred face and steady gaze, Abigail couldn't quite extinguish the tiny flame that had kindled in her chest. For the first time in 7 years, she wasn't alone in her fight. That realization was as terrifying as it was liberating. The days following Thornton's visit fell into an uneasy rhythm at Whispering Pines. Armed men patrolled the boundaries of the ranch day and night. Ezra insisted on escorts whenever anyone traveled to and from the property. The carefree atmosphere Abigail had glimpsed on her first evening had been replaced by watchful vigilance, a state all too familiar to her after 7 years of constant alertness. Yet, despite the tension, life continued. Cattle needed tending, horses required training, and the daily tasks of running a large ranch didn't pause for threats or danger. Slowly, cautiously, Abigail began to find her place in this strange new world. On her 3rd morning, she woke before dawn and slipped outside, drawn by the quiet and solitude of early morning. The air was cool and sweet, with pine, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten with the promise of sunrise. She stood on the porch, breathing deeply, feeling something close to peace for the first time in years. "You're up early." Abigail flinched at the voice, her hand automatically reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She turned to find Ezra approaching from the direction of the bunkhouse, a steaming cup in his hand. "Force of habit," she replied, relaxing slightly when she identified who had spoken. In the canyons, dawn and dusk were the safest times to move. Ezra nodded understanding in his dark eyes. "Smart. Animals are settling down or just waking up. Humans are at their least alert." He offered her the cup. "Coffee." After a moment's hesitation, Abigail accepted it, cupping her hands around the warm ceramic. The bitter aroma was comforting in its familiarity. Coffee had been one of the few luxuries she'd occasionally stolen during her years in the wilderness. "Thank you," she said, the words still awkward on her tongue after so long without social niceties. Ezra leaned against the porch railing, his gaze sweeping the property with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to spotting trouble before it arrived. "Mr. Blackwood says you know the canyons better than anyone," he remarked, "that you survived where most would have perished." Abigail sipped the coffee, neither confirming nor denying his statement. "I lived 40 years as someone else's property." Ezra continued, his tone conversational despite the weight of his words. "Learned to read people, to anticipate their moods, their actions. Survival skill, same as tracking or hunting." Abigail glanced at him, understanding dawning. "You were a slave." "Until 65. Freedom came late for those of us in Texas." His expression remained impassive, but a shadow crossed his eyes. "Some scars don't show on the skin." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two survivors recognizing in each other a shared understanding that needed no words. "Mr. Blackwood bought this land 10 years ago," Ezra said finally. "It was nothing then, overgrazed, neglected. Most folks said he was a fool to waste good money on bad land." "But he proved them wrong," Abigail observed, looking out over the thriving ranch. "He did." Pride colored Ezra's voice. "Man has vision, and he knows what it means to rebuild from nothing." Before Abigail could ask what he meant, the door opened behind them and Sophia emerged, her expression softening when she spotted them. "Ah, You found coffee already. Good. She nodded approvingly. Breakfast in 30 minutes. The boy is already in the barn, of course. Noah's always been an early riser, Ezra remarked, just like his father. Sophia made a sound that might have been agreement or concern. That child needs more than horses for company. Not natural for a boy his age to be so silent. As they spoke, Abigail noticed movement at the edge of the property, a slight figure making its way through the tall grass toward the line of pine trees. She recognized Noah's slender form and the purposeful way he moved clearly, trying to avoid detection. "Does he often wander off alone?" she asked, interrupting the conversation. Ezra followed her gaze, frowning slightly. "Not usually, no. Especially not with Thornton's threats still fresh." Without conscious decision, Abigail handed the coffee cup back to Ezra. "I'll follow him. Make sure he's safe." Before either of them could object, she was down the porch steps and moving across the yard with the silent, efficient gait of a predator. 7 years in the wilderness had taught her to move without leaving tracks to blend with her surroundings until she was nearly invisible. She kept Noah in sight as he entered the pine forest, staying far enough back that he wouldn't detect her presence. The boy moved with surprising confidence through the trees, following what appeared to be a familiar path. After about 15 minutes, the forest opened into a small clearing dominated by a large boulder. A stream gurgled nearby, creating a peaceful sanctuary hidden from the main ranch. Noah approached the boulder and sat with his back against it, drawing his knees up to his chest. From her position at the edge of the clearing, Abigail could see his face clearly for the first time since her arrival. The resemblance to his father was striking, the same blue eyes and strong jawline, but where Mason's face showed confidence and determination, Noah's reflected only sorrow and something close to fear. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the early morning light. A locket, Abigail realized watching, as the boy opened it and stared at whatever was inside, his expression a mixture of longing and grief. The scene was so private that Abigail felt like an intruder. She was about to withdraw when a twig snapped somewhere to her right. Noah's head jerked up, fear replacing sorrow, as he quickly tucked the locket away and scrambled to his feet. Abigail froze, every sense alert. That hadn't been her. Someone else was in the forest. Moving swiftly but silently, she circled toward the source of the sound, keeping low to the ground. Through the trees, she caught a glimpse of a figure watching the clearing. A man with a rifle, his attention fixed on Noah. Without hesitation, Abigail charged, her years of survival instinct taking over. The man barely had time to register her presence before she slammed into him, knocking the rifle from his hands and driving him to the ground. They rolled down a slight incline, Abigail fighting with the desperate strength of someone who'd faced death daily for 7 years. She came out on top, pinning the man with her knee against his throat, her hand gripping a sharp stone she'd snatched during the struggle. "Who are you?" she demanded, pressing down hard enough to restrict his breathing without cutting it off completely. "Why are you watching the boy?" The man's eyes bulged with fear and lack of oxygen. He clawed at her knee, making choking sounds until she eased the pressure slightly. "Speak," she ordered, the stone poised to strike if he made any threatening move. "Tucker," he gasped. "Name's Tucker. Work for Thornton. Just watching. Not hurting nobody." "A spy," Abigail hissed, increasing the pressure again. "Watching a child." "Orders," the man wheezed. "Watch the ranch. Report back." From behind her came a soft sound, the snapping of a twig underfoot. Abigail whirled, still maintaining her hold on Tucker, to find Noah standing a few feet away, his blue eyes wide with shock as he took in the scene. In the moment of distraction, Tucker bucked beneath her, nearly throwing her off. Abigail slammed him back down the stone in her hand, now pressed against his temple. "Stay still," she warned, her voice low and dangerous, "or I'll spill your brains across the forest floor." The threat, delivered with cold certainty, froze Tucker more effectively than any physical restraint. He lay panting beneath her, no longer struggling. "Noah," Abigail said without taking her eyes off her captive, "run back to the ranch. Find your father. Tell him we have a visitor from Thornton." The boy hesitated, clearly torn between fear and fascination. "Go!" Abigail urged more sharply this time. "Now!" Noah turned and sprinted back toward the ranch, moving faster than Abigail would have thought possible for his slight frame. "The boy doesn't talk," Tucker said, a note of desperate cunning entering his voice. "Everyone knows that. He can't tell his pa nothing." "He'll find a way," Abigail replied coldly. "Now we wait. And if you move—" She pressed the stone harder against his temple, letting him feel its sharp edge. "Well, let's just say I didn't survive 7 years in the wilderness by being merciful." Tucker swallowed hard, believing every word. The red-haired devil's reputation ensured that her threat carried weight far beyond the actual stone in her hand. They remained locked in that position for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 15 minutes. Eventually, the sound of approaching horses broke the silence of the forest. Moments later, Mason burst into view, rifle-ready, Ezra and Jim close behind him. Noah clung to his father's back, his face pale but determined. "Abigail." Mason's eyes took in the scene in an instant, Abigail pinning a stranger to the ground, the discarded rifle a few feet away. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she replied, not relaxing her hold on Tucker. "Found this snake watching Noah in the clearing. Says he works for Thornton." Mason dismounted in one fluid motion, his expression hardening as he approached the captive. "Tucker, isn't it? One of Thornton's hired guns." Tucker managed a jerky nod, his eyes darting between Mason and Abigail with growing fear. "Get up," Mason ordered, rifle trained steadily on the man's chest. Slowly, Abigail rose gracefully, keeping the stone in her hand as she stepped back to allow Tucker to stand. The man scrambled to his feet, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I wasn't doing nothing wrong," he protested. "Just looking around is all. On private property with a rifle watching my son." Mason's voice was dangerously calm. "I'd call that something wrong." Tucker's gaze shifted nervously. "Mr. Thornton just wanted information. Said to watch the place, see who comes and goes. That's all." "And what were you supposed to do if you saw something interesting?" Mason asked. "Like my son alone in the woods?" Tucker licked his lips, saying nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "Ezra," Mason said, not taking his eyes off Tucker, "escort our visitor to the property line. Make sure he understands what will happen if he or any of Thornton's men set foot on Whispering Pines again." "With pleasure, boss." Ezra's usually kind face was hard as granite as he seized Tucker's arm in an iron grip. "Let's go, boy." As they led the captive away, Mason turned to Abigail, his expression softening from cold anger to concern. "Thank you," he said simply. "If you hadn't followed Noah—" Abigail shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "I saw him leaving. Thought he might need watching." Mason's gaze moved to his son, who stood nearby, eyes downcast, but listening intently. "Noah, what were you thinking coming out here alone? You know it's not safe right now." The boy didn't respond. Of course, but his shoulders hunched slightly at his father's gentle rebuke. "He comes here often," Abigail said, surprising herself by speaking up for the boy. "It's a special place for him." Mason looked at her sharply. "How do you know that the path is well worn?" and he moved with purpose, not exploration. She gestured toward the boulder. There's a spot where the grass is flattened from repeated sitting. He comes here to be alone. Mason processed this information, his expression a mixture of surprise and something close to shame, as though he should have known this about his son. Noah darted a quick glance at Abigail, something like gratitude flickering in his blue eyes, before he looked away again. "Well, it's not safe to come alone anymore," Mason said firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "Not until we resolve this situation with Thornton." He extended his hand to his son, who took it after only a moment's hesitation. With his other hand, Mason reached out and touched Abigail's shoulder briefly, a gesture of thanks that startled her with its casual contact. "Come on," he said. "Let's get back to the ranch. Sophia will be holding breakfast, and heaven help us if we let her food get cold." As they walked back through the forest, Mason leading his horse with Noah at his side, Abigail found herself watching father and son with a strange ache in her chest. There was love there, palpable even through Noah's silence and Mason's awkward attempts to bridge the gap between them. Love complicated by grief and guilt, but love nonetheless. It had been so long since Abigail had witnessed such ordinary human connection that she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. The realization left her feeling oddly bereft, as though she'd lost something she hadn't known she was missing. "You didn't tell me you were a warrior as well as a survivor," Sophia remarked later that morning as she showed Abigail how to knead bread dough. The older woman had insisted that Abigail learn some civilized skills now that she was living under a roof again. "I'm not a warrior," Abigail replied, focusing on the unfamiliar task of working the dough. "Just someone who's learned to fight when necessary." Sophia made a sound that was half laugh, half snort. "Ezra says you took down a man twice your size without breaking a sweat. I'd call that a warrior." Abigail shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. It was instinct, nothing more. Instinct that saved Noah. Sophia's dark eyes were knowing. That boy has suffered enough loss for one lifetime. Losing his mother broke something in him. Abigail hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her since overhearing Mason comfort his son during the nightmare. "What happened to her? To Catherine?" Sophia's hands stilled on the dough. "It is not my story to tell, Nina, but," she sighed, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone. "3 years ago, she hanged herself from the big oak behind the house. Noah found her." Abigail's stomach clenched at the image. No wonder the boy had stopped speaking. "She was not well," Sophia continued quietly. "In her mind, you understand beautiful womankind when she was herself. But something dark lived inside her, ate at her happiness like a worm in an apple. Mr. Blackwood did everything he could, brought doctors from as far as Denver. Nothing helped. And Noah blames himself," Abigail guessed, remembering Mason's words during the nightmare. "She wasn't your fault, Noah. You have to believe that," Sophia nodded sadly. "Children always do know. They think the world revolves around them, that they cause everything good and bad." Abigail thought of her own childhood, of the years following her parents' murder, when she'd wondered if somehow she could have prevented it, saved them somehow. Even at 13, she'd known better, but the feeling had persisted nonetheless. "Mr. Blackwood blames himself too," Sophia added, her voice dropping even lower, "for not seeing how bad it had become, for being away when it happened. He carries that guilt like a stone around his neck." They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic motion of kneading dough oddly soothing. Eventually, Sophia spoke again, her tone deliberately lighter. "The boy likes you. I saw how he looked at you when you returned from the forest." Abigail frowned. "I doubt that. He doesn't know me." He knows you saved him, Sophia countered. And children, they sense things adults miss. Noah has good instincts about people. Before Abigail could respond, the kitchen door opened, and Mason entered, looking tired but composed. "Ezra's back," he reported. "Tucker won't be bothering us again, too scared of running into the red-haired devil a second time." He smiled slightly at Abigail, a gesture that softened his scarred face and reached his eyes. "Good," Sophia declared. "Maybe now you'll join us for lunch instead of pacing like a caged puma." Mason accepted the gentle rebuke with a nod. "I need to speak with Abigail first, if you don't mind her abandoning her bread-making lesson." Sophia waved a flour-covered hand. "Go, go. The bread will wait. Although," she added with a pointed look at Abigail, "a woman should know how to bake bread wild or not." Abigail wiped her hands on a towel, oddly reluctant to leave the warm kitchen and Sophia's straightforward company. But curiosity won out, and she followed Mason to his study where he closed the door behind them. "I owe you more than thanks for this morning," he said without preamble. "If anything had happened to Noah—" "It didn't," Abigail interrupted, uncomfortable with his gratitude, "and I only followed him because it seemed strange for him to wander off alone." Mason studied her for a moment, his blue eyes as thoughtful. "You have good instincts and remarkable courage." Abigail shifted under his gaze, unused to being the focus of such attention. "Did you want to speak to me about something specific, Mr. Blackwood?" "Usan," he corrected gently. "And yes, after what happened this morning, I think it's time we accelerated our plans. Thornton's not going to wait forever to make his move." He moved to his desk, where a map of the territory was spread out. "I need you to show me exactly where your father's claim was located. The journal has coordinates, but they're incomplete." Lorenzo was cautious, even in his private writings. Abigail approached the map warily. She'd avoided thinking about Red Rock Canyon for years, the memories too painful to revisit. But now, looking at the familiar contours of the land where she'd grown up, she felt an unexpected surge of determination. This was her birthright, stolen by violence and greed. Perhaps it was time to reclaim it. She leaned over the map, her finger tracing the winding path of a river until it came to rest on a particular formation. "Here," she said quietly. "Our home was here at the mouth of what the locals called Devil's Throat Canyon. The gold deposit was further in where the canyon narrows." Mason marked the spot with a pencil. "That's Thornton land now. Has been for almost a decade." "It was never his to take," Abigail replied, anger coloring her voice. "My father filed a legal claim. There were papers, which I'm sure disappeared the night of the attack," Mason finished grimly. "But Lorenzo sent copies to the territorial governor's office. If they still exist, they'd be in the archives in Santa Fe." "That's a long journey." "Yes, which is why I've asked Dr. Reed to make it for us. She has a cousin who works in the governor's office, less likely to raise suspicion than if I went myself." Abigail raised an eyebrow, impressed by his foresight. "You've been planning this for some time." "Since I first suspected you were Lorenzo's daughter, yes." Mason straightened, meeting her gaze directly. "But there's something else we need, something only you can provide." "What's that?" "Proof that you are who you say you are. Documentation of your identity as Abigail Rossi." Abigail frowned. "Everything was destroyed in the fire. We lost everything." "Not quite everything," Mason said carefully. "Your father once mentioned a family Bible, one that recorded births, deaths, marriages. He kept it in a metal box buried beneath the root cellar floor." The memory hit Abigail like a physical blow, her father placing the heavy Bible in the box, explaining it was their family's history, precious beyond gold. She'd forgotten that detail in the chaos that followed, in the desperate struggle for mere survival. If it survived the fire, she said slowly. If it's still there, then we'd have proof of your identity, Mason finished. Combined with your father's journal and the claim documents, if Dr. Reed can find them, we'd have a strong case against Thornton. Abigail's mind raced. The thought of returning to the place where her life had shattered was terrifying, but the possibility of justice after so long was powerful motivation. When? She asked simply. Tomorrow, at first light. Mason's expression was grim but determined. We can't afford to wait. Thornton's already making moves against us. Abigail nodded, her decision made. I'll be ready. As she turned to leave, Mason spoke again, his voice softer. Abigail, I know what I'm asking isn't easy. Returning to that place, it will bring back painful memories. She paused, her hand on the doorknob. Payne and I are old companions, Mr. Blackwood. We understand each other well. Mason's eyes reflected a deep sadness, as though her words had confirmed something he'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. No one should have to become accustomed to pain, Abigail, especially not someone who's already endured so much. The compassion in his voice threatened to crack the hard shell she'd built around her emotions. Abigail left quickly before he could see the unexpected moisture in her eyes. Twilight settled over whispering pines, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. Abigail sat on the porch steps, watching as the first stars appeared overhead. The day's events had left her restless, her mind too active for sleep, despite the physical exertion of tackling Tucker and the emotional toll of agreeing to revisit her childhood home. The sound of the door opening behind her made her tense slightly, but she relaxed when Noah emerged, a book clutched in his hands. The boy hesitated when he saw her, clearly considering a retreat back inside. It's all right, Abigail said, moving over to make space on the step. I don't mind company. Noah regarded her warily for a moment before making his decision. He sat beside her, leaving a careful distance between them, and opened his book. In the fading light, Abigail could see it was a volume about horses filled with detailed illustrations. They sat in companionable silence as darkness deepened around them. Noah turned the pages of his book, occasionally glancing at Abigail, as though checking if his presence bothered her. She remained still, oddly comforted by the quiet company. Eventually, Noah closed his book and reached into his pocket, withdrawing the locket she'd seen earlier. He hesitated, then held it out to her, his expression a mixture of shyness and determination. Surprised, Abigail accepted it, handling the delicate silver oval with care. May I open it? Noah nodded, his eyes intent on her face. Inside was a miniature portrait of a beautiful woman with fair hair and Noah's blue eyes. Her smile was gentle, but somehow sad, as though she carried a sorrow even in happiness. Your mother, Abigail said softly. It wasn't a question. Noah nodded again, his gaze now fixed on the portrait. She was beautiful, Abigail observed, studying the fine features that Noah had inherited. You have her eyes. And the boy's expression brightened slightly at this observation, and he pointed at his own face, then made a gesture toward the main house. Yes, you look like your father, too, Abigail agreed, understanding his meaning. You're fortunate that way. I look like my mother, but my sister Isabella was the image of our father. Noah's head tilted slightly, curiosity evident in his expression. My family died when I was 13, Abigail explained, surprised at her willingness to share with this silent child. Bad men came and killed my parents. My sister and I were hidden, but we were found afterward. We were separated. I never saw her again. Noah's face crumpled with sympathy, and to Abigail's astonishment, he reached out and patted her hand awkwardly, a child's gesture of comfort that nearly undid her composure. It was a long time ago, she said, her voice rougher than she intended. 7 years. Noah pointed at the locket, then at his heart, his meaning clear. I keep my mother here too. The simple gesture from a boy who had known his own share of loss touched Abigail deeply. They sat together in the gathering darkness, two wounded souls finding momentary comfort in shared grief. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Mason appeared from the direction of the barn, his expression softening when he spotted them on the steps. "There you are," he said, his voice gentle. "I was wondering where you'd disappeared to, Noah." The boy quickly pocketed the locket, rising to his feet with a shy glance at Abigail. He held up his book, showing his father what had occupied him. The horse anatomy book Dr. Reed brought you. Learning anything useful?" Mason's tone was casual, as though having a normal conversation with a child who could respond. Noah nodded enthusiastically, opening the book to a particular page and pointing at an illustration of a horse's leg. "The fetlock joint, yes. Important to understand for treating lameness." Mason ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "It's getting late, though. Why don't you head up to bed? We've got an early start tomorrow." Noah hesitated, glancing at Abigail, as though reluctant to end their quiet companionship. "Go on," she said gently. "Thank you for showing me your book. And the locket." The boy ducked his head in acknowledgement, then slipped past his father and into the house, his footsteps light on the wooden floor. Mason took the place his son had vacated, settling beside Abigail with a tired sigh. "He showed you Catherine's locket." Abigail nodded. "She was beautiful." "Yes, she was." Sadness tinged Mason's voice, inside and out when she was well. "She loved Noah more than anything. That's what makes it so hard for him to understand why she left." They sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the ranch distant cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the whisper of wind through pine needles creating a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "Sophia told me," Abigail said finally, "about how Catherine died, how Noah found her." Mason tensed slightly beside her, then relaxed with a deep exhale. "I thought she might. Sophia believes in speaking truth, even when it's painful." "I'm sorry." Abigail offered the words inadequate, but sincere. "Thank you." Mason stared out into the darkness, his profile strong against the light spilling from the house windows. "The worst part is that I knew she was struggling. She'd attempted it before twice. I thought we'd turned a corner. She seemed better that spring, more present, more herself." The raw pain in his voice made Abigail look away, uncomfortable with witnessing such vulnerability. "I was in town that day." Mason continued, the words emerging as though drawn from some deep well of grief. "Noah was supposed to be with Sophia, but he slipped away, went looking for his mother. He was only 13. The same age I was when I lost everything." Abigail thought a strange coincidence that created an unexpected bond between her and the silent boy. "He hasn't spoken a word since." Mason finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not one word in 3 years." "Sometimes," Abigail said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "silence is the only way to survive unbearable pain. Words are inadequate, dangerous even." Mason turned to look at her, really look at her, as though seeing past the hard exterior to the wounded soul beneath. "You understand him," he said, wonder in his voice. "That's why he showed you the locket. He sensed that you know what it's like to lose everything in an instant." Abigail shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. "I just recognize the look. I've seen it in my own reflection often enough." Mason was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he asked, "What happened to your sister Abigail after you were separated?" The question reopened an old wound, one that had never truly healed. "I don't know," she admitted, the words painful to speak aloud. "The man who found us in the root cellar, he said he'd take us somewhere safe. But he sold us instead. Isabella to a man heading east, me to a rancher near the border. And you never heard from her again." Abigail shook her head, her throat tight with suppressed emotion. "She would have looked for me if she could. Isabella was... She was brave and stubborn, and she loved me fiercely. If she were alive, she would have found a way to come back for me." Mason seemed to consider his next words carefully. "People change, Abigail. Trauma changes them. Perhaps she survived but couldn't face returning to a place with such painful memories." "No," Abigail's voice was firm. "Not Isabella. She wouldn't have abandoned me no matter what happened to her. If she's not here, it's because she can't be. Because she's gone." The certainty in her tone brooked no argument, and Mason didn't press further. Instead, he changed the subject, perhaps sensing that she'd reached the limit of what she could discuss. "We should leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "It's a full day's ride to your family's property, and I'd prefer to arrive with enough daylight to search the root cellar thoroughly." Abigail nodded, grateful for the return to practical matters. "Who will accompany us?" "Ezra and Jim. I've asked Dr. Reed to stay here with Noah, Sophia, and Pete. The ranch needs protection, especially with us gone." "Thornton will be watching," Abigail warned. "After today's incident with Tucker, he'll be even more vigilant." "I'm counting on it," Mason replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in his voice. "He'll be watching the roads, the obvious routes. We'll take the old Apache trail through the high country, slower but less likely to be observed." Abigail raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "You know the Apache trails?" "Ezra does. He was a scout for the army before he came to work for me." Mason's lips curved in a slight smile. "There's more to my foreman than meets the eye." They lapsed into silence again, but it was comfortable now, the shared plans for tomorrow creating a sense of common purpose. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. "You should get some rest," Mason said, eventually rising to his feet. "Tomorrow will be challenging in more ways than one." Abigail nodded, but made no move to follow him inside. The night air was cool and clean, the open space around her a comfort after years of sleeping under the stars. Being indoors still felt confining, despite the relative luxury of her room. Mason seemed to understand without explanation. "I'll have Sophia leave a blanket for you in case you decide to sleep out here." The simple act of acceptance of her differences, her quirks, born of survival, touched Abigail unexpectedly. "Thank you," she said, the words encompassing more than just the offer of a blanket. Mason nodded, his eyes warm in the dim light spilling from the windows. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Mason," she replied, using his first name for the first time. As he disappeared into the house, Abigail turned her gaze back to the stars, feeling a strange sense of peace, despite the dangers that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring a confrontation with her past, a return to the place where her childhood had ended in blood and fire. But tonight on this peaceful porch, with the memory of Noah's simple gesture of comfort and Mason's quiet understanding, she allowed herself to hope just a little that the future might hold more than mere survival. The abandoned Rossi homestead lay in a secluded valley bordered by red rock cliffs, its location both beautiful and remote. As their small party approached, following a game trail that wound through scrubby juniper and sage, Abigail felt a growing tightness in her chest, as though an invisible band were constricting her breathing. 7 years. 7 years since she'd last seen this place, fleeing with nothing but terror and the clothes on her back. Now she returned a different person entirely, harder, colder, yet somehow more fragile than the 13-year-old girl who had hidden in the root cellar, listening to her parents die. Mason rode beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Ezra and Jim followed a short distance behind, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. They had traveled since dawn, taking the high trails as planned, seeing no one but a lone Apache hunter who had watched them pass without interfering. "Are you all right?" Mason asked quietly, noting her rigid posture and shallow breathing. Abigail nodded tersely, unable to trust her voice. The valley spread before them unchanged yet utterly different. Where once a neat cabin had stood, surrounded by her mother's carefully tended garden, only a blackened foundation remained reclaimed by desert vegetation. The barn was a skeletal ruin, its charred beams like the ribs of some great dead beast. Only the stone-lined wells seemed intact, a circle of darkness against the sun-baked earth. They dismounted at the edge of what had once been the yard, tethering their horses in the shade of a gnarled cottonwood that had somehow survived the fire. Abigail stood motionless, assaulted by memories both sweet and terrible. Her father's laugh, as he swung her high in the air, her mother's hands gentle as they braided her hair, Isabella's voice reading aloud from their few precious books on long winter evenings. And over these tender recollections, the terrible overlay of that final night, shouting gunshots, her mother's scream, cut brutally short her father's desperate plea, "Run, girls, hide. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Abigail!" Mason's voice broke through the roar of memory, his hand hovering near her arm, but not quite touching, respecting her space even now. "We don't have to do this. We can find another way." She shook her head, drawing a deep breath. "No, I need to do this. For my parents, for Isabella. For myself," she added silently. With deliberate steps, she approached the ruins of the cabin, her eyes scanning the overgrown area where the root cellar had been. A mound of earth and stone marked its location, partially collapsed, but still distinguishable. "There," she said, pointing. The entrance was on the east side with stone steps leading down. Ezra and Jim set to work immediately clearing debris and digging with the tools they'd brought. The physical labor was almost a relief after the tension of the journey, giving them something concrete to focus on rather than the ghosts that seemed to whisper from every shadow. As the men worked, Abigail found herself drawn to the well. She approached it cautiously, half expecting to see her own reflection staring back when she peered over the edge. Instead, there was only darkness, cool air rising from the depths, with the faint scent of clean water. "It still works," Mason observed, coming to stand beside her. "The water table in this valley is high. Your father chose the location well." "He was a good man," Abigail said softly. "Gentle, scholarly. He didn't deserve what happened to him." Mason's expression darkened. "Few victims deserve their fate, Abigail. That's what makes injustice so intolerable." Before she could respond, Ezra called out from the cellar excavation. "Found something. The entrance is clear stone steps, just like Miss Rosie said." They hurried over to find that the men had indeed uncovered a set of crude stone steps leading down into darkness. The roof of the cellar had partially collapsed, but the entrance remained passable if precarious. "I'll go first," Abigail said, already moving toward the opening. Mason caught her arm. "Wait. It could be unstable. Let me—" "No," she interrupted firmly. "This was my home, my family's cellar. I know where to look." After a moment's hesitation, Mason nodded, releasing her. "Take this," he said, handing her a small lantern they'd brought, "and be careful. If anything feels unsafe, come back up immediately." Abigail lit the lantern and began her descent, each step taking her further back in time. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused, raising the lantern to illuminate the space. The root cellar was smaller than she remembered, perhaps 8 feet square, with shelves along 2 walls. Most had collapsed, their contents long since rotted away or carried off by animals. The earthen floor was littered with debris, broken jars, rotted wood, the scattered bones of small creatures who had sought shelter and found only a tomb. Abigail moved carefully, mindful of the weakened ceiling above. The place where she and Isabella had huddled, terrified and silent, was still visible, a small alcove beneath the lowest shelf, just large enough for 2 frightened girls to squeeze into. She knelt in the center of the room, setting the lantern beside her, and began to probe the earthen floor with her fingers. Her father's words echoed in her memory. Beneath the center stone, Abby. That's where we keep our family's heart. The stone was still there, half buried in dirt, but recognizable by its flat, smooth surface. Abigail dug around it with her hands, loosening the packed earth until she could grip the edges. It was heavy, requiring all her strength to lift and move aside. Beneath lay a shallow pit, and within it, a metal box, tarnished but intact. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs as she lifted it out, running her fingers over the ornate lock. "The key," she murmured to herself. "Where did Papa keep the key?" She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think past the fog of years and trauma. The key, small brass kept on a chain around her father's neck, always with him, even in sleep, which meant it had been with him when he died, when his body burned in the cabin fire. Abigail's hands trembled as the realization sank in. Without the key, the box remained locked, its contents inaccessible. "Abigail," Mason's voice called down from above. "Did you find anything?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I found the box, but I don't have the key." She gathered the box in her arms and made her way back to the steps, climbing carefully to the surface. The bright afternoon sunlight was jarring after the gloom of the cellar, making her blink as she emerged. Mason, Ezra, and Jim gathered around as she set the box on a flat rock, their expressions expectant. "It's locked," she explained, indicating the ornate mechanism. "My father kept the key with him always. It would have been with his body." Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. "I see. That complicates matters. We could break it open," Jim suggested, eyeing the box. "Doesn't look too sturdy." "No," Abigail said sharply. "This is all that remains of my family's possessions. I won't have it destroyed." "Perhaps there's another way," Ezra offered thoughtfully. "I have some skill with locks. May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded, allowing Ezra to examine the box. His large, work-roughened hands were surprisingly delicate as he turned the box, studying the lock from various angles. "Old but not complicated," he murmured. "I'll need something thin and strong. A hairpin would be ideal, but—" Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a slender metal tool that looked like a small file. "Will this do?" Ezra accepted it with a raised eyebrow. "You just happen to carry a lockpick boss, a man of many talents," Mason replied with a ghost of a smile. "Let's just say I haven't always operated strictly within the law." This glimpse of a less law-abiding past intrigued Abigail, but she remained focused on the box as Ezra began to work on the lock. His fingers moved with practiced precision, probing and testing, occasionally pausing to adjust his approach. After several tense minutes, there was a satisfying click. Ezra sat back with a nod of satisfaction. "There. Should open now." Abigail reclaimed the box, her heart racing as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a square of faded velvet, lay several items: a large leather-bound Bible, a packet of letters tied with a blue ribbon, a small daguerreotype in a silver frame, and a folded document sealed with red wax. With trembling hands, she lifted out the Bible first. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, the gilt edges of the pages dulled with age. Opening it, she turned to the family record pages in the center, where births, marriages, and deaths were meticulously recorded in her father's elegant handwriting. There it was, her own birth, neatly logged beneath Isabella's Abigail Eleonora Rossi, born May 17, 1859, to Lorenzo and Maria Rossi. She traced the words with her fingertip, a tangible connection to the parents she'd lost, the life that had been stolen from her. Next, she removed the daguerreotype, holding it up to catch the light. The image showed her family as they had been when she was about 10. Her father standing proud and straight, her mother seated with a gentle smile, Isabella and Abigail on either side, all dressed in their Sunday best. A moment of happiness frozen in time, preserved against the ravages of violence and loss. "That's you," Mason said softly, looking over her shoulder at the image. "You have your mother's eyes." Abigail nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The girl in the picture was almost unrecognizable to her now, smiling, innocent, untouched by the horrors that lay ahead. Finally, she picked up the sealed document, turning it over in her hands. The wax seal bore the imprint of the Territorial Land Office official, and imposing. "That's it," Mason breathed, his voice tight with excitement. "The claim deed. The proof we need." Abigail broke the seal, carefully unfolding the document to reveal a formal declaration of ownership, signed and notarized, granting Lorenzo Rossi exclusive rights to mine a specified area within Red Rock Canyon. Attached was a detailed survey map showing the boundaries of the claim and the geological formations that had led her father to believe gold lay beneath the rocky soil. "This changes everything," Mason said, scanning the document quickly. "With this, plus your father's journal and the family Bible proving your identity, we have a solid legal case against Thornton. Dr. Reed should return from Santa Fe within the week with the filed copies, and then—" He stopped abruptly, his head turning toward the trail they had followed into the valley. Ezra and Jim were already on their feet, hands moving to their weapons. "Riders coming," Ezra said tersely. "At least 5, maybe more." Mason's expression hardened. "Thornton must have had men watching the old roads after all." Abigail quickly gathered the Bible daguerreotype and deed, returning them to the metal box and securing the lid. "What now?" "We make for the high country," Mason decided, already moving toward the horses. "If we can reach Apache Pass by nightfall, we'll have the advantage. They don't know those trails like Ezra does." They mounted swiftly, Abigail clutching the precious box before her on the saddle. As they urged their horses toward the western edge of the valley, she cast one last glance at the ruins of her childhood home, a final farewell to the ghosts that lingered there. The sound of pursuit grew louder behind them, but Abigail felt no fear, only a cold determination. She had reclaimed a piece of her past today, a tangible link to the family she had lost. Now it was time to secure her future and make Wallace Thornton pay for the destruction he had wrought. The chase was relentless, Thornton's men closing the gap as Mason's party pushed their horses hard through increasingly difficult terrain. Ezra led them up a steep, rocky trail that switchbacked toward the ridgeline, aiming for the narrow pass that would take them into Apache territory, less traveled and more dangerous, but their best hope of escape. "They're gaining," Jim called from his position at the rear. 5 riders, heavily armed." Mason glanced at Abigail, riding close beside him, her face set with determination despite the physical toll of the hard riding. The metal box was secured to her saddle, now freeing her hands to manage her horse on the treacherous path. "We need to split up," he decided, raising his voice to be heard over the pounding hooves. "Give them multiple targets." Ezra nodded his agreement. "The fork ahead, Jim and I will take the south branch, draw them off, if we can. You and Miss Rossi continue to the pass." "No," Abigail objected. "I won't have you risking your lives for me." "Not just for you," Mason countered. "For justice, for what's right. Ezra and Jim know what they're doing." Before she could protest further, they reached the fork in the trail. With a quick nod to Mason, Ezra and Jim veered sharply south, making no attempt to hide their direction. Their sudden movement and the dust they kicked up would be clearly visible to their pursuers. "Come on," Mason urged, leading Abigail up the northern branch, which climbed even more steeply toward the pass. "If we're lucky, they'll follow Ezra and Jim, thinking we're all together." Luck, however, wasn't with them. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Abigail glanced back to see two riders still on their trail, while the other three pursued Ezra and Jim. "Two still following," she reported grimly. Mason's expression hardened. "We need to reach the pass before they catch us. Once we're through, we can use the ravines for cover." They pushed their tired horses harder, the animals straining against the steep incline and loose shale that threatened to slide beneath their hooves. The pass loomed ahead, a narrow notch between towering red rock formations, casting deep shadows across the trail. Just as they entered the pass, a shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off stone inches from Mason's head. He ducked instinctively, turning in the saddle to return fire with his rifle. The exchange forced their pursuers to seek cover, buying precious seconds as Mason and Abigail emerged from the far side of the pass. "There!" Mason pointed to a steep ravine that branched off from the main trail. "We can lose them in there." They guided their horses down the treacherous slope, the animals sliding more than stepping on the loose gravel. At the bottom, a shallow stream provided firmer footing, and they urged their mounts upstream, using the water to hide their tracks. After several hundred yards, Mason signaled a halt, leading them into a hidden alcove, where the stream undercut the bank, creating a natural shelter. They dismounted quickly, Mason helping Abigail down as her legs threatened to buckle after the punishing ride. "We'll wait here," he whispered, drawing his pistol. "If they follow our trail, we'll have the advantage of surprise." Abigail nodded, retrieving the box from her saddle and clutching it to her chest. Her entire body ached from the hard riding, but her mind remained sharp alert to every sound and movement. They stood in tense silence, listening. The only sounds were the gentle gurgle of the stream and their horses' labored breathing. Minutes stretched endlessly, each moment pregnant with potential danger. Finally they heard it, the distant clatter of hooves on stone, voices arguing about which way to go. Their pursuers had reached the ravine, but seemed uncertain whether to follow. "They're hesitating," Mason breathed, his mouth close to Abigail's ear to avoid being heard. "That's good. Means they've lost our trail." As if to contradict him, a shout went up. "Tracks here!" They went upstream. Mason's grip tightened on his pistol. "Get ready," he murmured. "When they pass, we'll take them by surprise." Abigail set the box carefully on the ground and drew the knife Mason had given her before they left the ranch. Not ideal against guns, but better than nothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady, her mind clear with the familiar focus that danger always brought. The riders approached slowly, their horses splashing through the shallow water. From their hidden position, Mason and Abigail could see them clearly, two rough-looking men with rifles at the ready, scanning the banks with wary eyes. "I don't like this, Cobb," one muttered. "Feels like a trap." "Thornton's paying good money to bring back the woman and whatever she found," the other replied. "You want to tell him we got scared and turned back?" Rather face Thornton's temper than Blackwood's bullet, the first man grumbled, but he continued forward nonetheless. As they drew even with the alcove, Mason gave Abigail a slight nod. In one fluid motion, he stepped out from cover, pistol leveled. "That's far enough, gentlemen," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Drop your weapons." The men froze, caught completely by surprise. But rather than surrender, the one called Cobb made a desperate move, swinging his rifle toward Mason. The shot echoed off the ravine walls, startlingly loud in the confined space. Cobb tumbled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder and cursing viciously. The other man immediately raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with fear. "Wise decision," Mason commented, keeping his pistol trained on the uninjured man while Abigail emerged from hiding. "Now both of you are going to deliver a message to Wallace Thornton." Cobb glared up from where he lay in the shallow water, blood seeping between the fingers clutched to his wounded shoulder. "Go to hell, Blackwood." "Eventually, perhaps," Mason replied coolly. "But before I do, I intend to see justice done for the Rossi family. Tell Thornton we have the deed. We have proof of his crimes, and we're coming for him legally through the territorial courts." The unwounded man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Mr. Thornton won't take kindly to threats." "It's not a threat," Abigail said, stepping forward, her green eyes blazing with intensity. "It's a promise. Tell him Abigail Rossi has returned to claim what's hers. Tell him I remember his face the night my parents died. Tell him there's nowhere in this territory he can hide from what he's done." Her voice, cold and precise, sent a visible shiver through both men. The legend of the red-haired devil gave her words an almost supernatural weight, as though she were pronouncing a curse rather than promising legal action. "Now go," Mason ordered, gesturing with his pistol. "Help your friend onto his horse and ride back to your master. And remember, next time I won't aim for the shoulder." They waited until the men had disappeared back down the ravine before allowing themselves to relax slightly. Mason reloaded his pistol methodically, his movements precise despite the aftermath of danger. "That was risky," Abigail observed. "They could have both decided to fight." "Calculated risk," Mason replied, holstering his weapon. "Men like that, they value their lives more than loyalty to someone like Thornton. Besides, now, they'll deliver our message, which is exactly what I want." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "You want Thornton to know we have the deed. Won't that just make him more dangerous?" "Yes," Mason agreed, a grim smile touching his lips. "And desperate men make mistakes. Thornton's managed to hide his crimes for years because he's been careful calculating. Push him hard enough, and he'll show his true nature publicly where it can't be ignored by the territorial authorities." Abigail considered this strategy, impressed, despite her concerns. "You've thought this through. For longer than you know." Mason's hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his cheek, a gesture Abigail had noticed before when Thornton was mentioned. "Come on, we should move. Find somewhere more defensible to wait for nightfall." As they mounted their horses again, Abigail couldn't help asking the question that had nagged at her since their first meeting. "Your scar. Thornton gave it to you, didn't he?" Mason was silent for a long moment as they rode slowly upstream, searching for a better place to rest. Finally, he nodded. 7 years ago, when I first came to this territory, looking for your father's daughters." "What happened?" "I asked too many questions, made it clear I didn't believe the official story about Apache raiders." His voice was matter-of-fact, but tension radiated from his rigid posture. "Thornton's men caught me alone one night, delivered a warning that I chose to ignore." Abigail studied his profile, seeing the hardness that came into his expression when he spoke of that time. "Yet, you stayed, kept looking." "I owed your father a debt," Mason replied simply, "and I've never been one to back down from bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are." They rode in silence for a while, following the stream's winding course until it widened into a small pool at the base of a cliff. A cluster of boulders provided natural cover, and the cliff at their backs meant they couldn't be approached unseen. "Here," Mason decided, dismounting. "We'll rest until dark, then circle back to meet Ezra and Jim at the rendezvous point." Abigail slid from her saddle gratefully, her muscles protesting after the long, hard ride. She retrieved the metal box and settled on a flat rock, opening it to ensure the contents had survived the journey intact. The Bible daguerreotype and deed were all undamaged, much to her relief. As she ran her fingers over the family photograph, a sense of purpose solidified within her. This wasn't just about reclaiming stolen property or clearing her name. It was about honoring her parents' memory, about ensuring that their murderer faced justice after 7 long years of impunity. Mason busied himself seeing to the horses, loosening their saddle girths, and letting them drink from the pool. When he'd finished, he joined Abigail, settling beside her with a tired sigh. "Do you think Ezra and Jim got away safely?" she asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "I'd bet on it," Mason replied with confidence. "Ezra knows this country better than anyone, and Jim's no slouch in a tight spot. They'll meet us at the North Ridge as planned." Abigail nodded, wanting to believe him. In just a few days, these men had become more than allies to her. They were the closest thing to friends she'd had since losing her family. The thought of them coming to harm because of her was deeply troubling. "This isn't your fault," Mason said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "Thornton's men would have come for us regardless. They've been watching the ranch since we returned from town." "Perhaps," Abigail acknowledged. "But I've brought danger to your home, to your son." "Noah was in danger the moment I decided to stand against Thornton," Mason interrupted gently. "That was my choice, made long before you arrived. And it was the right choice, Abigail. Some fights can't be avoided without losing something essential about ourselves." His words resonated with something deep inside her, the part that had refused to be broken. Despite years of hardship and solitude, the core of steel that had kept her fighting when surrender would have been easier. "When this is over," she said slowly, "what happens then?" Mason looked at her, his blue eyes thoughtful. "That depends on what you want, Abigail. If we succeed in proving your claim, the gold mine will be legally yours. You could sell it live comfortably anywhere you choose. And if I don't want to leave?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Then you'd be welcome to stay," Mason replied, his voice carefully neutral, despite the spark of something that flared briefly in his eyes. "Whispering Pines is a big ranch. There's room for another pair of hands, especially ones as capable as yours." The offer hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Abigail found herself imagining a future she'd never dared contemplate during her years of mere survival. A permanent home, purposeful work people who valued her for who she was rather than feared her for what rumors claimed she might be. And Noah, the silent boy, who had shown her his mother's locket, who somehow understood her in ways no one else could. The thought of leaving him behind created an unexpected ache in her chest. "I don't know what I want," she admitted finally. "For so long, survival was my only goal. Anything beyond that seemed impossible." "It's not impossible anymore, Abigail," Mason said softly. "Whatever you choose, whatever path you take after this, it will be because you chose it freely. No one will force your hand or dictate your future. That much, at least, I can promise you." The simple declaration that her future was hers to determine affected Abigail more deeply than any grand gesture could have. Freedom. Real freedom had seemed an unattainable dream for so many years. Now it lay within reach if they could succeed in their dangerous gambit against Thornton. As the shadows lengthened around them, casting the ravine in shades of purple and gold, Abigail allowed herself to imagine what such freedom might feel like. Not just freedom from pursuit or hunger or fear, but freedom to build, to create, to form connections that weren't severed by violence or necessity. It was a heady, terrifying prospect. And for the first time in 7 years, Abigail found herself looking forward rather than back toward possibility, rather than mere survival. The sun slipped behind the western cliffs, plunging their shelter into premature twilight. Soon it would be dark enough to travel safely, to make their way back to where Ezra and Jim hopefully waited. And after that, back to Whispering Pines, to Noah and Sophia, and the others who had, against all odds, begun to feel like a kind of family. "It's time," Mason said quietly, rising to his feet. "Are you ready?" Abigail secured the metal box once more, her mind clear, her purpose firm. "Yes," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm ready." Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers Thornton might yet pose, Abigail faced them now, not as the solitary hunted creature she had been, but as part of something larger, a cause, a community, perhaps even the beginnings of a home. The red-haired devil was no more. In her place stood Abigail Rossi, daughter of Lorenzo, and Maria, sister to Isabella, and a woman determined to reclaim not just her birthright, but her place in the human world she had for so long avoided. It was, she reflected, as they mounted their horses and set off into the gathering darkness, a transformation as profound as it was unexpected. And somehow, riding beside Mason Blackwood through the wild country they both knew so well, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. The return journey to Whispering Pines unfolded without further incident. Ezra and Jim had indeed escaped their pursuers and were waiting at the rendezvous point, relieved to see Mason and Abigail emerge from the darkness unharmed. They traveled through the night using the stars for navigation, avoiding main trails and known watering holes where Thornton's men might be watching. Dawn was breaking as they crested the final ridge overlooking the ranch, the buildings below bathed in soft golden light. Abigail felt an unexpected surge of emotion at the sight, something close to homecoming, though she quickly suppressed the feeling as dangerous and premature. "All seems quiet," Ezra observed, scanning the property with experienced eyes. "No sign of trouble." They approached cautiously nonetheless, alert for any indication of ambush or intrusion. As they rode into the yard, the front door of the main house burst open, and Noah raced down the steps, his face alight with relief. He reached his father's horse just as Mason dismounted, flinging his arms around him in a fierce hug that spoke volumes despite his continued silence. Mason embraced his son tightly, closing his eyes briefly. "I'm back, Noah. Safe and sound, just as I promised." Dr. Reed appeared in the doorway, her practical skirts dusty from travel. "Thank God," she called, hurrying toward them. "We've been worried sick. Pete spotted riders near the north boundary yesterday, thought they might be Thornton's men." "They probably were," Mason replied grimly, keeping one arm around Noah's shoulders as he greeted the doctor. "We were followed from the Rossi homestead. Had to split up to throw them off our trail." Eleanor's sharp gaze moved to Abigail, taking in her exhausted appearance and the metal box secured to her saddle. "You found something." "Everything," Abigail confirmed, dismounting stiffly after the long ride. "The Deed family records, proof of my identity." "Excellent," Eleanor said with evident satisfaction, "because I have something too." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded document. The territorial governor's office still had the filed copy of your father's claim, just as Mason suspected. With both documents, there can be no question of ownership. The news should have been cause for celebration, but Abigail noticed a tension in Eleanor's expression that suggested there was more to tell, something less positive. "What else?" Mason asked clearly, seeing the same signs. Eleanor glanced at Noah, then back to Mason. "Perhaps we should discuss it inside after you've all had a chance to rest and refresh yourselves." Mason nodded, understanding the doctor's reluctance to speak freely in front of his son. "Noah, why don't you help Ezra with the horses? I'll be in shortly." The boy hesitated clearly, reluctant to let his father out of his sight after their separation, but eventually nodded and moved toward Ezra, who was already leading the tired horses toward the barn. As the others dispersed to their various tasks, Mason, Abigail, and Eleanor entered the house, where Sophia immediately set about preparing coffee and food for the returning travelers. They gathered in Mason's study, closing the door to ensure privacy. "What didn't you want to say in front of Noah?" Mason asked without preamble, his exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes, but his mind still sharp. Eleanor placed her folded document on the desk beside the metal box that contained Abigail's finds. "There's been a development in Silver Springs. A woman arrived the day after you left asking questions about the red-haired devil and Mason Blackwood." Abigail tensed her hand unconsciously, moving to the knife at her belt. "One of Thornton's people?" "No," Eleanor replied, her gaze steady on Abigail's face. "She claims to be Isabella Rossi." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment, sound fading, as Abigail struggled to process the doctor's words. That's impossible," she managed finally, her voice barely audible. "Isabella is dead." "She's very much alive," Eleanor countered gently, "and looking for her sister." Mason moved closer to Abigail, concern evident in his expression. "Are you certain it's her, Eleanor? Could it be an imposter, someone Thornton hired to trick us?" "I considered that possibility," the doctor acknowledged. "But she had details no imposter could know, described her parents, the homestead, even the metal box you recovered. And physically there's a striking resemblance to Abigail, though her hair is darker now." Abigail gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. "If she's alive, if she's been alive all this time, why didn't she find me sooner?" "She says she tried," Eleanor replied softly. "For years. But by the time she escaped the man who bought her, you had already fled into the wilderness. All she heard were legends of the red-haired devil stories. She couldn't quite bring herself to connect with the little sister she remembered." "Where is she now?" Mason asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I brought her here," Eleanor admitted. "She's resting in my room upstairs. The journey was difficult for her. She's not in good health." Abigail felt as though the floor were tilting beneath her feet. Everything she'd believed for 7 years suddenly called into question. Isabella alive. Her sister, her protector, the person she'd mourned alongside her parents alive. All this time. "I need to see her," Abigail said, already moving toward the door. "I need to know if it's really her." Mason caught her arm gently. "Abigail, wait. You're exhausted, and this is overwhelming news. Perhaps you should rest first. Give yourself time to process." She shook her head, pulling free of his grasp. "No, I've waited 7 years without knowing. I won't wait another minute." Without further discussion, she left the study and headed for the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard Mason and Eleanor following, but she paid them no mind, focused solely on reaching the room where her sister might be waiting. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor moved ahead to lead the way to a door at the end of the hall. She knocked softly, then opened it without waiting for a response. "Isabella," she said gently, "there's someone here to see you." Abigail stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat. A woman lay on the bed, propped up with pillows, her dark red hair streaked with premature gray. She was thin, almost gaunt, her once pretty features marked by years of hardship. But her eyes, those were the same amber eyes Abigail remembered, now widening with recognition and disbelief. "Abby." The name emerged as a whisper, fragile with hope and fear. "Is it really you?" For a moment, Abigail couldn't speak, couldn't move. Then something broke loose inside her, a dam of emotion held back for 7 long years, and she was across the room in an instant, gathering her sister into her arms with a sob that tore from the depths of her soul. "Bella," she wept, using the childhood nickname no one else had ever called her sister. "Bella, I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you forever." Isabella's arms came around her weakly at first, then with growing strength, as though drawing vitality from the contact. "My little Abby," she murmured, her voice breaking. "My brave, wild little sister. I never stopped looking for you. Never." They clung to each other, 7 years of separation, dissolving in a flood of tears and broken words of relief, apology, love. Mason and Eleanor quietly withdrew, closing the door to give the reunited sisters privacy in their emotional reunion. Time lost meaning as Abigail and Isabella held each other, touching faces, hair, hands, as if to confirm that neither was a ghost or dream. Eventually their tears subsided, leaving them exhausted, but unwilling to let go to risk separation again. "Tell me everything," Abigail said, finally settling beside her sister on the bed, still clutching her hand. "What happened to you after that night?" Isabella's expression darkened with painful memories. "The man who found us in the root cellar, he said he would take us somewhere safe. I believed him at first. He seemed kind, concerned. But he took us to a camp outside of town where he met with other men." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "They separated us, put us in different wagons. I fought Abby. I fought so hard to stay with you, but they hit me, knocked me unconscious. When I woke, we were miles away, and you were gone." Abigail tightened her grip on her sister's hand, her throat constricting with rage at what they'd both endured. "Where did they take you?" "East to St. Louis. The man who bought me was a banker named Wilson. He made me his mistress." Isabella's voice remained steady, despite the shame and pain evident in her eyes. "I was 17, alone, terrified. I did what I had to do to survive." "You don't need to explain," Abigail said fiercely. "Not to me, never to me." Isabella gave her a grateful look before continuing. 3 years I lived in that house, like a bird in a gilded cage. Then Wilson died, heart failure. His wife knew about me, of course, had always hated me. She threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back." "But you came back west," Abigail prompted when her sister fell silent. "You looked for me." "As soon as I could," Isabella confirmed. "I worked as a seamstress, saved every penny, made my way back to Arizona territory. But by then our home was long burned, the land sold. No one knew what had happened to Lorenzo Rossi's daughters." She reached up to touch Abigail's cheek, her eyes filled with wonder. "Then I started hearing whispers about a red-haired woman living wild in the canyons. A devil, they called her. A witch. But I knew, somehow I knew it must be you, my fierce little sister who always loved the wilderness, who could track rabbits and find water where no one else could. Why didn't you find me sooner?" Abigail couldn't keep the question from escaping, though she tried to soften it with a gentle tone. Isabella's face crumpled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. I tried, Abby. For years I tried. Hired guides, trackers. But the canyons are vast, and you didn't want to be found. You were a ghost, a shadow, always one step ahead of anyone who came looking. The truth of this struck Abigail forcefully. She had become expert at avoiding human contact, at disappearing into the landscape at the first sign of pursuit. How many of those pursuers had been sent by Isabella rather than those who wished her harm? And then I fell ill. Isabella continued, gesturing to her thin frame. Consumption, the doctors say. I've been fighting it for 2 years now, growing weaker. I thought I would die without ever seeing you again. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes once more. But you're here now. We're together again. And you're going to get better, Bella. Dr. Reed is an excellent physician, and the air here is good for the lungs. You'll recover your strength. Isabella smiled, though the expression held a shadow of doubt. Perhaps, but what matters is that I found you at last. When I heard in town about Mason Blackwood buying the red-haired devil at auction, about his connection to our father, I knew this was my last chance. And you were right, Abigail assured her, squeezing her hand. We have so much to tell you, Bella. We found the metal box, Papa's deed to the mine. We're going to bring Thornton to justice for what he did to our family. A strange expression flickered across Isabella's face at the mention of Thornton, something Abigail couldn't quite interpret. Before she could question it, however, there was a soft knock at the door. Come in. Isabella called, her voice stronger now despite her evident exhaustion. Mason entered carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. Sophia thought you might want some refreshment, he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. And I wanted to properly introduce myself, Mason Blackwood. Isabella studied him with interest. The man who saved my sister. Dr. Reed told me what you did buying her freedom, protecting her from Thornton. I owe you a debt I can never repay. There's no debt, Mason replied sincerely. Your father once saved my life. Helping his daughters is the least I could do to honor that. And still thank you. Isabella's gaze moved between Mason and Abigail, a knowing look entering her tired eyes. You've clearly been good for my sister. I've never seen her so at peace. Abigail felt a flush rising to her cheeks at the implication in her sister's tone. Mason has offered me sanctuary, nothing more, she said quickly. And now we're working together to expose Thornton's crimes. A worthy goal, Isabella murmured, though something in her expression suggested reservation. Thornton is a dangerous man, more dangerous than you might realize. We're well aware of his capabilities, Mason assured her. But with the documents we've recovered, plus witnesses willing to testify to his illegal seizure of the Rossi claim, we have a strong case against him. Isabella nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. I hope you're right, for all our sakes. Abigail frowned, slightly puzzled by her sister's subdued reaction. The Isabella she remembered had been fiery, determined, never one to back down from a fight. This caution seemed out of character, though perhaps illness and years of hardship had tempered her spirit. You should rest now, Mason said, noting Isabella's evident fatigue. We can discuss our plans further when you're stronger. Yes, Abigail agreed reluctantly, not wanting to leave her sister's side, but recognizing the need for recovery. I'll be close by if you need anything, Bella. Just call for me. Isabella caught her hand as she rose to leave. Promise you won't disappear again. Promise you'll be here when I wake. The vulnerability in the question broke Abigail's heart. I promise, she said firmly. Nothing could drag me away now that I've found you again." Satisfied, Isabella released her hand and settled back against the pillows, her eyes already drifting closed with exhaustion. Abigail tucked the blankets around her gently, then followed Mason from the room, closing the door softly behind them. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed by the emotional reunion and the revelations it had brought. "Are you all right?" Mason asked quietly, his blue eyes concerned. "I don't know," Abigail admitted, her voice barely audible. "For 7 years I believed she was dead. I mourned her alongside our parents. And now she's here alive but so changed, so diminished." "Illness takes a heavy toll," Mason observed. "And she's clearly been through hardships we can only imagine. Give her time, Abigail. The sister you remember may still be there beneath the weariness and pain." Abigail nodded, wanting to believe him. "There's something else, though. Something in the way she reacted when we mentioned Thornton. Almost as if she's afraid of him," Mason finished when she trailed off. "I noticed that too. Perhaps she knows something about him that we don't, some reason to fear him beyond what we already understand." "Perhaps," Abigail agreed, though the explanation didn't quite satisfy the nagging sense of wrongness she'd felt. "I'll ask her when she's stronger." Mason touched her arm lightly. "You should rest too. You've been riding all night, and the shock of finding your sister alive must be exhausting in itself." The gentle concern in his voice warmed her unexpectedly. "I will, soon. But first, I need to clean up and change. I feel like I've brought half the desert back with me." "Of course." Mason stepped back, giving her space. "I'll have Sophia prepare a bath for you. And Abigail, I'm truly happy for you. Finding Isabella alive, it's the kind of miracle that rarely happens in this harsh land." His sincerity was evident, with no trace of the reservation she herself felt. Abigail managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mason, for everything." As she walked away toward her room, Abigail couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right, that her sister's return, miraculous as it seemed, carried complications she had yet to understand. But, for now, exhaustion overwhelmed her suspicions, and the promise of clean clothes and a hot bath beckoned irresistibly. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and emotion at Whispering Pines. Isabella grew stronger under Eleanor Reed's careful medical attention and Sophia's hearty cooking. The sisters spent hours together, filling in the gaps of their 7-year separation, relearning each other's faces, voices, mannerisms. Yet, despite the joy of reunion, Abigail couldn't entirely dismiss her initial sense of unease. The sister who had returned to her was undeniably Isabella, but changed in ways that went beyond physical illness or hardship. There was a guardedness to her, a hesitation when certain topics arose, particularly anything related to Wallace Thornton or their plans to bring him to justice. On the 3rd morning after their return from the Rossi homestead, Abigail found Noah sitting on the porch steps, whittling a small piece of wood with remarkable skill for one so young. She settled beside him, watching his hands work the knife with precise, careful movements. "That's beautiful," she commented, nodding toward the emerging shape, a horse. She realized its lines flowing and graceful despite the simple material. "You have a gift." Noah ducked his head at the praise, but continued working his slender fingers sure and steady. After a moment he paused and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object which he placed in her palm. It was a tiny wooden fox, exquisitely carved, its pointed face and bushy tail capturing the essence of the animal with minimal detail. The wood had been polished to a soft sheen, smooth beneath her fingers. "For me?" Abigail asked, surprised and touched by the gift. Noah nodded, a shy smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you," she said, genuinely moved. It's perfect." They sat in companionable silence for a while, Noah returning to his carving, while Abigail turned the little fox over in her hands, admiring the craftsmanship. Eventually she spoke again, her voice soft with reflection. "Your father told me you haven't spoken since your mother died. 3 years is a long time to keep silent." Noah's hands stilled momentarily, but he didn't look up. "I understand you know," Abigail continued gently. "After my parents were killed, after I lost Isabella, or thought I had, I barely spoke for nearly a year. Words seemed pointless, inadequate, and speaking meant connecting with people being vulnerable. It was easier to be silent, to disappear into myself." The boy glanced at her sideways, a flicker of recognition in his blue eyes. "But eventually I realized that silence, while it protects us, also isolates us, keeps us trapped in our pain." Abigail fingered the wooden fox, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not saying you should speak, Noah. That's your choice to make when you're ready. If you're ready. I just want you to know that I understand, and that whatever happened the day your mother died, it wasn't your fault." Noah's knife slipped, nicking his finger. A small bead of blood welled up bright against his skin. Abigail immediately reached for her handkerchief, gently taking his hand and pressing the cloth to the cut. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have distracted you." To her surprise, Noah didn't pull away from her touch. Instead, he looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a question she couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" she asked. "What are you trying to tell me?" The boy's expression grew frustrated, clearly, struggling with the limitations of his self-imposed silence. Finally, he set aside his carving and stood gesturing for her to follow him. Curious Abigail rose and walked with him around the side of the house toward the large oak tree that stood a short distance from the main building. As they approached, she noticed a small wooden cross planted at its base, a grave marker. Catherine's grave, she realized with a pang of sympathy for both Noah and Mason. Noah stopped a few feet from the marker, his face solemn as he pointed first to the grave, then to himself, and finally made a slashing motion across his throat. "You saw her die." Abigail interpreted her heart aching for the boy. "You found her, hanging from this tree." He nodded, then pointed toward the house before making a writing gesture with his hand. "She left a note," Abigail guessed. Another nod, more emphatic this time. Noah pointed to himself again, then to his eyes, and mimed reading something. "You read it," Abigail said slowly, trying to understand what he was communicating. "The note your mother left. You found it." Noah's expression grew more intense, his gestures more urgent. He pointed to the house again, then made a shape in the air, a rectangle like a letter or document. "The note is still in the house?" Abigail asked, confused by his increasing agitation. "Noah, what are you trying to tell me?" Before he could attempt further explanation, a voice called from the porch. "Noah, Abigail, where are you?" It was Isabella, looking stronger than she had since her arrival, though still thin and pale in her borrowed dress. She spotted them by the oak tree and waved, starting down the steps toward them. Noah immediately tensed, his expression closing off. Without another gesture or backward glance, he turned and hurried away, disappearing around the corner of the barn. Abigail frowned, puzzled by his abrupt departure and the urgent message he'd been trying to convey. Something about his mother's suicide note, something important enough to break through 3 years of silence, at least in his own way. "Was that Mason's boy?" Isabella asked, as she reached Abigail's side. "Dr. Reed mentioned he doesn't speak." "Yes, that was Noah," Abigail confirmed, still gazing after the vanished boy. "He was showing me this." She gestured toward Catherine's grave, not wanting to explain the complex interaction that had just occurred. Isabella's expression softened with sympathy. How tragic. Mason told me a little about his wife's suicide. The poor child, finding her like that. Abigail nodded absently, her mind still on Noah's peculiar behavior. Bella, you seem stronger today. How are you feeling? Much better, Isabella replied, linking her arm through Abigail's as they began walking back toward the house. Dr. Reed is a miracle worker, and Sophia's determined to fatten me up like a Christmas goose. Abigail smiled, relieved to see some of her sister's old spirit returning. I'm glad. We have so much to catch up on, so many years to reclaim. Yes, Isabella agreed, though a shadow passed across her features. About that Abby. Mason told me you plan to take legal action against Thornton to reclaim Father's gold mine. With the documents we've recovered, we have a strong case, Abigail said, noting the familiar tension that entered her sister's body at the mention of Thornton. The territorial governor's representative is expected tomorrow to review the evidence. Isabella stopped walking, turning to face Abigail directly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you and Mason Blackwood involved? The question caught Abigail off guard. Involved? No, of course not. He offered me sanctuary protection. That's all. But you care for him, Isabella pressed, studying her sister's face intently. And he clearly cares for you. Abigail felt heat rising to her cheeks. We've been through dangerous situations together. That creates a certain bond. But there's nothing more to it than that. Isabella seemed to consider this, her amber eyes, so like Abigail's own, searching for something in her expression. And if Thornton is brought to justice, if Father's claim is restored to us, what then? Would you stay here at Whispering Pines? I haven't thought that far ahead, Abigail admitted, though it wasn't entirely true. The possibility of remaining at the ranch had indeed crossed her mind, especially after her conversation with Mason in the ravine. Why do you ask? Isabella hesitated, then squeezed Abigail's arm gently. Because I worry about you, little sister. You've been alone for so long, surviving by your wits, trusting no one. I don't want you to mistake gratitude or the need for protection with deeper feelings. Something in her tone struck Abigail as odd, a forced casualness that didn't quite ring true. Is there something you're not telling me, Bella? Something about Mason? No. Isabella backtracked quickly. Mason seems like a good man. I'm just concerned. It's a sister's prerogative to worry, isn't it? Before Abigail could press further, they heard the sound of approaching horses, several riders coming fast. Mason emerged from the house rifle in hand, with Ezra close behind him. The two men moved swiftly to intercept the visitors, positioning themselves between the approaching riders and the house where the women stood. Get inside, Mason called over his shoulder. Both of you, now! Isabella immediately turned toward the house, pulling Abigail with her, but Abigail resisted. No, I won't hide. Not anymore. Breaking free of her sister's grasp, she moved to stand beside Mason, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead figure with a jolt of hatred, Wallace Thornton, flanked by Sheriff Montgomery and several armed men. Stay calm, Mason murmured to her as the party reined in their horses a short distance away. Let me handle this. Thornton dismounted with the heavy grace of a man accustomed to imposing his will through sheer physical presence. His fleshy face was flushed with what might have been triumph, his small eyes gleaming with malice as they fixed on Abigail. Mason Blackwood, he called, his voice carrying across the yard. I've come to reclaim stolen property and arrest a fugitive from justice. There's no stolen property here, Thornton, Mason replied evenly. And no fugitives, just honest citizens on private land. I suggest you turn around and leave while you still can. Thornton's smile widened, revealing teeth stained by tobacco. "Oh, but you're wrong on both counts. Sheriff Montgomery has a warrant for the arrest of Abigail Rossi, charged with theft of legal documents and trespassing on my property. And as for stolen property," he gestured toward the metal box visible through the open door of Mason's study. "That box and its contents belong to me, legally purchased along with the Rossi land 7 years ago." "You know that's a lie," Abigail spoke up, unable to contain her anger. "You murdered my parents and stole our land. The deed proves the gold mine belongs to the Rossi family, to my sister and me." At the mention of Isabella, Thornton's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something like uncertainty crossing his features. "Your sister is dead, girl. Has been for years." "No, she's not," Abigail countered, a fierce pride entering her voice. "Isabella is alive. She's here at Whispering Pines. Another witness to your crimes, Thornton." A gasp from behind them made Abigail turn. Isabella stood frozen on the porch steps, her face drained of color, her eyes fixed on Thornton with an expression of pure terror. "Isabella," Thornton said softly, his voice carrying a note of recognition that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. "It's been a long time." The familiarity in his tone, the way Isabella seemed to shrink under his gaze, it triggered a terrible suspicion in Abigail's mind. "Bella, what's going on? How does he know you?" Isabella's eyes darted frantically between Abigail and Thornton, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Abby, I can explain." "She hasn't told you," Thornton interrupted, cruel amusement spreading across his face. "Your dear sister has been keeping secrets, it seems. Isabella and I are old acquaintances." "Stop," Isabella pleaded, descending the steps on unsteady legs. "Please don't do this." "Isabella has been working for me for the past 5 years," Thornton continued relentlessly. "Ever since she returned to the territory seeking information about her little sister, the notorious red-haired devil." The world seemed to tilt beneath Abigail's feet, the revelation hitting her like a physical blow. "That's not true," she whispered, looking to her sister for denial. "Tell me that's not true, Bella." Isabella's face crumpled, tears spilling down her pale cheeks. "I had no choice, Abby. He found me as soon as I returned to Arizona. Said he would help me find you, but only if I worked for him." "Worked is a generous term," Thornton commented with a smirk. "She's been my eyes and ears in Silver Springs for years, reporting every whisper, every rumor about her wild little sister, and more recently, about Mason Blackwood's interest in the Rossi case." Mason's expression had hardened to granite as he listened to this exchange. "So that's how you've always been one step ahead of us. You had an informant, Isabella." "I never meant to hurt anyone," Isabella sobbed, her composure completely shattered. "I just wanted to find Abby. Thornton promised if I helped him, he would let me take her away somewhere safe, somewhere far from Arizona territory." "And you believed him?" Abigail's voice cracked with disbelief and betrayal. "After what he did to our parents, you trusted him?" Isabella seemed to collapse inward, her illness and emotional distress overwhelming her. She sank to her knees on the dusty ground, her thin shoulders shaking with sobs. "I was desperate, Abby, so desperate to find you, to have some family left in this world." Thornton watched the scene with evident satisfaction, clearly enjoying the pain his revelation had caused. "Touching as this reunion is, I have business to conclude. Sheriff, arrest the Rossi woman and seize that metal box. It contains documents stolen from my property." Montgomery dismounted reluctantly, his hand on his pistol, but his expression uncertain. Now see here, Thornton. I'm not sure. You have a warrant, Sheriff. Thornton cut him off sharply. Signed by Judge Wilson himself. Do your duty. As Montgomery moved forward, Mason raised his rifle. Take one more step, Harlow, and I'll consider it an act of aggression against the people under my protection. Well, the sheriff halted, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to directly challenge Thornton's authority. The armed men behind Thornton shifted restlessly, hands hovering near their weapons. The standoff might have erupted into violence then, and there had not a new voice interrupted high, clear, and startling in its unexpected presence. She didn't kill the bounty hunter. All heads turned toward the source of the cry. Noah stood at the corner of the house, his thin frame rigid with determination, his face pale but resolute. The sound of his voice, unused for 3 years, seemed to shock everyone into stillness. Noah. Mason breathed, his rifle lowering slightly in his surprise. Son, what are you saying? The red-haired devil didn't kill Travis Hodge. Noah continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. I saw who did. I was there. Thornton's face darkened with fury. The boy's lying, clearly deranged from his mother's suicide. My mother didn't kill herself, Noah shouted, years of silence giving way to a torrent of suppressed truth. She was murdered. I saw it all. I saw everything. A deadly hush fell over the yard. Mason took a step toward his son, his expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. Noah, what are you saying? Your mother. She left a note. You found her hanging from the oak tree. The note was a forgery, Noah replied, tears streaming down his face, but his voice steady. I saw him write it. I saw him hang her body after she was already dead. I saw him murder her, and I saw him kill Travis Hodge, too. His trembling finger rose, pointing directly at Wallace Thornton. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Then Thornton gave a bark of laughter, though his eyes had gone cold and calculating. This is absurd. The boy is clearly disturbed, making up stories. Tell them about the red-haired woman, Noah interrupted, his young voice cracking with emotion. Tell them about the woman who came to see Mother the day she died. The woman who looked like Miss Abigail, but wasn't her. All eyes turned to Isabella, who had gone deathly pale, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. Isabella? Abigail whispered, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. You came here before you knew Catherine Blackwood. Isabella seemed unable to speak, her eyes wide with terror, as she looked from Abigail to Mason to Thornton like a cornered animal seeking escape. She came with a letter. Noah continued relentlessly, the words pouring out after years of enforced silence. A letter that made Mother cry. They argued. The red-haired woman left, and later that day he came. Again, the accusatory finger pointed at Thornton. He and Mother fought. He hit her again and again. She fell and didn't get up. Then he wrote a note and made it look like her handwriting. He hanged her from the oak tree. Mason had gone pale, his rifle now hanging forgotten at his side, as he struggled to process his son's terrible revelation. Noah, why didn't you tell me all these years? I was afraid, the boy admitted, his voice small once more. He saw me watching. He said if I ever told anyone, he would kill you too, Father. And then I would have no one left. A roar of rage tore from Mason's throat as he whirled toward Thornton, raising his rifle in one fluid motion. Only Ezra's quick action, grabbing the barrel and forcing it upward, prevented him from firing directly into Thornton's heart. Not like this, boss, Ezra hissed, struggling to restrain his employer. Not in front of your boy, not without justice. The moment of potential violence broke the paralysis that had gripped the others. Sheriff Montgomery turned to face Thornton, his hand now resting on his pistol with new purpose. "Is this true, Thornton?" he demanded, years of intimidation giving way to genuine outrage. "Did you murder Catherine Blackwood and frame that girl for Hodges' death?" Thornton's expression had gone from smug satisfaction to cold calculation. The boy is confused, traumatized. No one would take the word of a mute child over a respected businessman. "I would," came a new voice as Dr. Eleanor Reed emerged from the house, a document in her hand. "Especially when that child's testimony is supported by evidence." She moved to stand beside Noah, one hand on his shoulder, in a gesture of support and protection. "This is Catherine Blackwood's suicide note," she said, holding up the paper. "I've studied it carefully, compared it with samples of her handwriting from her journals and letters. It's a forgery skillfully done, but detectable to a trained eye. And there's more," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Travis Hodge didn't die from a knife wound as was claimed. The fatal injury was a bullet to the base of the skull execution style. I examined his body before burial, though Thornton insisted the cause of death was already determined." Thornton's hand moved toward his jacket, where a pistol was undoubtedly concealed. "This is a conspiracy," he snarled, his genial mask now completely abandoned. "Lies and slander from a woman who thinks she can practice medicine like a man, a half-wild girl, and a disturbed child." "And me," Isabella spoke up, suddenly rising shakily to her feet. "I can testify, too. I delivered the letter to Catherine Blackwood on your orders, Wallace. A letter claiming that Mason had been unfaithful, that he had a red-haired mistress in town. You wanted to destabilize her, to push her toward suicide. When that failed, you killed her yourself." Thornton's face contorted with rage. "You treacherous whore! After everything I did for you—" "You did nothing for me," Isabella retorted, finding a strength that belied her frail appearance. "You used me, threatened me, kept me from my sister for years while pretending to help me find her. But I won't be silenced anymore. I'll testify to everything I know about your crimes. The murders, the claim jumping, all of it." The balance of power had shifted palpably. Sheriff Montgomery moved away from Thornton, his hand now fully on his pistol. The armed men who had accompanied Thornton looked uncertainly at each other, clearly reassessing their loyalties in light of the mounting accusations. Thornton recognized his deteriorating position. With a movement like striking snake, he drew his concealed pistol and grabbed Isabella, pulling her against him as a shield, the barrel pressed to her temple. "Nobody move!" he shouted, backing toward his horse. "I'm leaving, and she's coming with me. Anyone tries to stop me, I'll put a bullet in her brain." "Wallace, don't," Montgomery pleaded, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You're only making things worse for yourself." "Worse?" Thornton laughed, a sound of genuine amusement tinged with madness. "There is no worse for me now, Harlow. Only escape, or death. And I don't intend to die today." Isabella stood rigid in his grasp, her eyes locked with Abigail's, a silent communication passing between them, an apology, a plea for understanding, perhaps even a goodbye. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded a tiny movement that only her sister would recognize as significant. "Let her go, Thornton," Mason demanded, his rifle still ready despite Ezra's restraining hand. "She's innocent in all this. Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel," Thornton spat, continuing his careful retreat, "is with anyone who threatens what's mine. The Rossi gold, this territory, it belongs to me. I built an empire from nothing, and I won't let it be taken by self-righteous fools who prattle about justice and rights." As he reached his horse, still maintaining his grip on Isabella, something changed in her posture, a gathering of resolve, a tensing of muscles. Abigail recognized the signs immediately, memories of childhood games and shared secrets flooding back. "Bella, no!" she cried, understanding her sister's intention a moment too late. Isabella drove her elbow hard into Thornton's substantial stomach, simultaneously twisting away from the gun at her temple. The move, born of desperation rather than skill, created just enough space for her to break free of his grasp. Thornton roared with pain and rage, his pistol swinging toward Isabella's retreating form. Two shots rang out, almost simultaneously, one from Thornton's weapon, the other from Mason's rifle. Isabella stumbled crimson blooming across the front of her borrowed dress as she fell to her knees. Thornton dropped his pistol, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face as he pressed his hand to the spreading red stain on his chest. "You actually shot me," he gasped, staring at Mason in apparent disbelief before toppling sideways into the dust. Abigail was already running, reaching Isabella just as she collapsed fully. She gathered her sister into her arms, pressing her hand desperately against the wound to stem the flow of blood. "Bella, stay with me," she pleaded, tears blurring her vision. "Please, stay with me. I just found you again. I can't lose you now." Isabella's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Abigail's face. "Little sister," she whispered, her voice faint but clear. "My brave, wild little sister. I'm so sorry for everything. I only wanted to protect you." "I know," Abigail sobbed, cradling her sister closer. "I understand now. Just hold on. Dr. Reed will help you. You're going to be fine." Eleanor was already beside them, her capable hands moving quickly to assess the wound. "Get her inside." She ordered, her professional demeanor taking over despite the chaos around them. Quickly, but gently. The bullet may have missed vital organs. As Ezra carefully lifted Isabella to carry her into the house, Abigail looked back to where Thornton lay motionless in the dust. Sheriff Montgomery kneeling beside him, with fingers pressed to his neck. "He's dead," the sheriff announced, looking up to meet Mason's gaze. "Clean shot through the heart." Mason lowered his rifle slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, grim satisfaction, residual rage, and profound sorrow. He turned to his son, who stood trembling but upright, the burden of years of silence finally lifted from his young shoulders. "Noah," he said softly, opening his arms. The boy ran to him, burying his face against his father's chest. As sobs racked his thin frame, the first sounds he had allowed himself in 3 years now pouring out in a flood of grief and relief. "I'm sorry, Father," he wept. "I wanted to tell you. Every day I wanted to tell you." "Shh," Mason soothed, holding his son tightly. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You were protecting me just as I should have protected you. The fault is mine for not seeing the truth, for not helping you find your voice sooner." As father and son clung to each other, beginning the long process of healing wounds too long left to fester, Abigail followed Ezra into the house, her mind focused solely on Isabella. The confrontation with Thornton, the revelation of her sister's complicated role in the events of the past 7 years, even the vindication of her own innocence, all paled in comparison to the desperate need to keep her sister alive. Isabella had betrayed her, yes, had worked for the man who murdered their parents, had even played a role in Catherine Blackwood's death, however unwittingly. But she was still Bella, still the sister who had read to her on long winter nights, who had taught her to braid her hair and track rabbits, who had held her as they hid in the root cellar, whispering that everything would somehow be all right. As Dr. Reed worked to save Isabella's life, Abigail held her sister's hand and prayed to a God she had long since stopped believing in, asking not for justice now, but for mercy, for a chance to forgive, to understand, to rebuild what had been broken by violence and fear and desperate choices. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the Arizona sky, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath its burning gaze. Thornton's men departed, their loyalty evaporating with their employer's death. Sheriff Montgomery remained, preparing to take formal statements from all involved, finally free to do his duty without Thornton's corrupting influence. And in a quiet bedroom, two sisters clung to each other on the narrow boundary between life and death, while a doctor fought to ensure that their reunion, so long delayed and so nearly destroyed, would not end before it had truly begun. 3 months later, Abigail stood on the porch of Whispering Pines Ranch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. The evening air carried the scent of pine and sage, a familiar aroma that had once meant danger and solitude, but now signified something closer to home. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of dinner being prepared. Sophia's cheerful Spanish curses as she battled with a particularly stubborn pot, Noah's clear laugh in response to something his father had said. Isabella's softer voice joining the conversation. Isabella had survived, though her recovery had been slow and painful. The bullet had damaged her lung, exacerbating her existing consumption. But Dr. Reed's skilled care and Sophia's determined nursing had gradually restored her to a semblance of health. She would never be robust again, the doctor had warned, but with proper care and the clean desert air, she might live for many years yet. The territorial courts had moved swiftly once Thornton's crimes were exposed. The Rossi claim was officially restored to Abigail and Isabella, along with substantial damages for the illegal seizure of their property. Other victims of Thornton's machinations had come forward, revealing a pattern of corruption and violence that had poisoned the territory for years. As for Abigail herself, she had been formally exonerated of all charges, her reputation as the red-haired devil transformed from feared outlaw to wronged survivor. The people of Silver Springs, once so quick to condemn her, now regarded her with a mixture of awe and shame-faced respect. None of it mattered much to Abigail. The opinions of townspeople, the gold mine, even the official recognition of her innocence, these were pale satisfactions compared to the recovery of her sister and the strange, unexpected family she had found at Whispering Pines. The screen door creaked open behind her, and Mason stepped out to join her on the porch, offering a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a smile. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Abigail replied, sipping the strong, sweet coffee. 3 months ago, I was a fugitive, believing I had no family left in the world. Now, you're a wealthy mine owner with a restored reputation, a recovering sister, and a teenage boy who seems to have adopted you as a surrogate aunt," Mason finished with a warm smile. "Quite a transformation." Abigail nodded, returning his smile with one of her own, a gesture that had become increasingly natural as the weeks passed. "Noah is remarkable. To have endured what he did, to have found the courage to speak when it mattered most. I'm not sure I could have been so brave at his age." "He admires you enormously," Mason observed. "We all do. Your strength, your resilience, they're extraordinary, Abigail." A faint blush colored her cheeks at the compliment. 3 months of regular meals, safe shelter, and the gradual relaxation of constant vigilance had softened the hard edges of her appearance, allowing glimpses of the woman she might have become had violence not diverted her path so drastically. "I've been thinking about the future," she said after a comfortable silence. "Isabella and I have discussed what to do with the mine. Neither of us wants to live at the old homestead, too many painful memories, and neither of us has any interest in mining operations." "What will you do with it then?" Mason asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Sell it, probably, to a legitimate mining company, one that will hire local workers at fair wages." Abigail turned to face him directly. "But that leaves the question of where we'll go. Isabella needs continued medical care, a stable environment. And I—" She hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. 7 years of solitude had left her ill-equipped for expressing emotions, especially those as complex and frightening as the ones she had developed for Mason Blackwood. "You," he prompted gently, his blue eyes intent on her face. "I find that I'm reluctant to leave Whispering Pines," she admitted finally. "To leave Noah. And you." Mason set his coffee cup on the porch railing, his expression serious but warm. "I was hoping you might feel that way. Both of you are welcome to stay as long as you wish. Forever, if that suits you." The word forever hung in the air between them, laden with meaning beyond mere hospitality. Abigail drew a deep breath, gathering courage for a leap more frightening than any physical danger she had faced in the wilderness. "And if I wish to stay, not just as a guest or friend, but as something more?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Isabella and I wish to make Whispering Pines our permanent home in every sense." Mason's face softened with an emotion that made her heart race. "Abigail Rossi," he said, taking her hand in his, "nothing would make me happier. This ranch has felt more like a home in the past 3 months than in all the years before you arrived. You, with your fierce spirit and compassionate heart, have brought light back into our lives, Noah's and mine." He stepped closer, his free hand gently tucking a strand of her copper hair behind her ear. "I love you, Abigail, not out of gratitude or obligation, but for the remarkable woman you are." The words, so long unimaginable in her world of survival and solitude, brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "Though I'm not sure I know how to be anything but wild and broken." "You're not broken," Mason said firmly. "You're beautifully, perfectly yourself. And as for being wild—" A smile touched his lips. "I've never had much interest in taming wild things. Their beauty lies in their freedom, their untamed spirit." Abigail laughed softly, remembering the auction where they had first met, the cruel talk of taming her and Mason's quiet defense of her humanity. How far they had come from that day. The screen door opened again and Noah poked his head out. "Sophia says dinner's ready," he announced, his voice still slightly hesitant after years of disuse but growing stronger each day. "And Isabella wants to know if you two are going to stand out here mooning at each other all evening." Mason chuckled, keeping hold of Abigail's hand. "Tell them we're coming, son." As Noah disappeared back inside, Mason turned once more to Abigail. "Shall we?" he asked, gesturing toward the door and the warmth and light beyond. Abigail nodded, a sense of rightness settling deep in her soul. The red-haired devil was truly gone, now laid to rest alongside the ghosts of her past. In her place stood simply Abigail, sister, friend, partner, her wild heart finally finding a place where it could beat freely without fear. "Yes," she said, squeezing Mason's hand as they moved toward the door together. "Let's go home." Behind them, the last rays of sunlight gilded the pine trees that gave the ranch its name, while ahead lay the golden glow of lamplight. the murmur of familiar voices, the promise of belonging that had once seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars now appearing in the darkening sky. For a woman who had survived 7 years in the wilderness, it was perhaps the greatest adventure, yet learning to live not just for survival, but for joy. To be not just wild, but free. To let her fierce, untamed soul find rest at last, in the shelter of love freely given and gratefully received. Abigail Rossi stepped through the door into her future, carrying her willed soul with her, not subdued or broken, but treasured for exactly what it was, a precious gift, hard-won through suffering, resilient beyond measure, and finally, beautifully at peace.